Let's start with the theory that touches every corner of this show, the one that once you hear it properly laid out, you genuinely cannot unhear. Because what we're talking about tonight isn't a quirky little fan observation or a fun piece of trivia someone posted on a forum at 2 in the morning. What we're talking about is the possibility, and there is serious, accumulated, canonical evidence behind this, that the Springfield nuclear power plant has been slowly and systematically poisoning every single living thing in Springfield for over 3 decades. And that the show has been telling you this, clearly and deliberately, since almost the very beginning. So, settle in, get comfortable. Let's go back to the very foundation of this theory and build it from the ground up, because it deserves that treatment. The Springfield nuclear power plant is not some background detail. It is the beating heart of the entire town. It is a 2-unit pressurized water reactor facility owned and operated by Charles Montgomery Burns, and it provides the primary source of electrical power for every home, every business, and every institution in Springfield. Without it, the town goes dark. And the man who owns it, the man who controls the switch, has structured his entire relationship with Springfield around that dependency. He holds the power, quite literally. Now, the first thing you need to understand about this facility is that it is, by any measurable standard, one of the most comprehensively unsafe industrial operations in the history of fiction. A surprise safety inspection of the plant, an inspection that Burns did not know was coming, which is the only kind that carries any weight, returned 342 separate violations. 342. To put that in some kind of perspective, that is not a building that has a few loose wires and a cracked window. That is a facility that is fundamentally, structurally, categorically unsafe at every level of its operation. The estimated cost to bring the plant into compliance with basic safety standards was $56 million. Burns, a man whose personal wealth runs into the billions, a man who can afford to send his physician on private jets, who maintains a personal mansion staffed by an army of servants, who has funded private military operations for his own amusement, refused to spend it. Not because he didn't have it, he had it many times over. He refused because spending that money would have required him to acknowledge that the problems existed. And acknowledging the problems would have opened a door that Burns has kept very deliberately shut for a very long time. The door that leads to the question of what decades of those violations have already done to the people of Springfield. Because it wasn't just paperwork violations, the show doesn't let you off that easily. The violations the inspection uncovered include radioactive waste being dumped directly into bodies of water that Springfield residents drink from and swim in, radioactive waste being disposed of on children's playgrounds, plutonium being used as a paperweight on an office desk sitting in the open air of a working environment, cooling towers patched with chewing gum not as a joke, as an actual repair solution that someone in that building looked at and said, "Yes, that'll do." Luminous rats running through the internal corridors of the facility, glowing softly in the dark, and human skeletons in the basement. Stop there for a moment. Human skeletons. In the basement of a working nuclear reactor, the show introduces this detail, shows you the bones, and then moves on. No investigation, no follow-up, no scene where someone stands over those remains and asks the most basic question that a functioning society would demand be answered. Who were these people, and how did they end up dead inside a nuclear power plant? That question is never asked. It is never answered. The bones are there, and then the episode continues, and Springfield carries on exactly as it was. The man whose job it is to stand between all of this and the people of Springfield, the safety inspector, the one human being whose professional purpose is to ensure that this facility does not become a catastrophe, is Homer Simpson. A man who the show's own creator has stated has an IQ of 55. A man who, in the episode where a doctor removes a crayon that has been lodged in his brain since childhood, experiences a dramatic and measurable increase in intelligence simply because a foreign object has been extracted from his neural tissue. That's where Homer's baseline was. He had a crayon in his brain, and that was his normal, and it was never found until he was an adult, and nobody in the Springfield medical establishment caught it, and he was the safety inspector for the entire time. Homer sleeps at his workstation. Homer eats during meltdown warnings. Homer once caused a genuine nuclear incident by throwing a donut into the reactor core, apparently curious about whether it would grow larger. This is the person responsible for preventing a radioactive catastrophe in a town of tens of thousands of people, and he has occupied that role for over 3 decades. Now, here is where the theory stops being an abstract exercise in dark humor and starts becoming something you have to take seriously. Because the evidence isn't just circumstantial, it's visible. It's right there on the screen, and it has been since Season 2. Blinky. That's where the trail begins. Season 2, and a three-eyed fish is pulled from a river near the power plant. 3 eyes. A fish with a fully formed, functioning third eye growing out of its head, pulled from the waterway directly downstream from a facility with 342 safety violations and a history of dumping radioactive material into local water sources. The episode treats this as a major event, which it is. A gubernatorial candidate uses Blinky as his central piece of evidence that Burns is poisoning the environment. It becomes national news within the show's universe. Burns is cornered, and he is forced to eat the fish on live television to demonstrate that it's harmless. He eats a three-eyed fish, on camera, as proof that everything is fine, and the town watches. And the town shrugs, and then the episode ends and nobody, not a journalist, not a scientist, not a concerned parent, not a member of the Springfield city government asks the follow-up question that is completely obvious. If the fish in the river have developed an additional eye, if the radiation from this facility has caused a visible, measurable, anatomical mutation in the wildlife living in the same water that Springfield's residents use, then what exactly is it doing to the people drinking that water? What is it doing to the children swimming in it? What is it doing to the families washing their food in it and bathing in it and making their morning coffee with it every single day? The show doesn't answer that question directly in that episode, but it has been answering it, obliquely and consistently, across every season since. Let's talk about what the residents of Springfield actually look like, because this is the detail that the radiation theory hinges on. And it's a detail that is hiding in plain sight because we've been watching this show long enough that we've simply stopped seeing it as strange. Homer Simpson has a massive overbite, eyes that protrude from his skull in a way that defies standard human anatomy, 4 fingers on each hand, a skull shape that would concern any neurologist, and a body that can absorb and recover from physical trauma that would kill an ordinary human being. He's been shot. He's been electrocuted with enough voltage to stop a heart. He has fallen from cliffs, been struck by vehicles moving at speed, survived explosions, been crushed by industrial equipment, and walked away from each of these events in a way that real human physiology simply does not permit. His healing rate is not just remarkable, it is biologically impossible, and he has worked in direct proximity to an active reactor core for his entire adult life. Marge Simpson has those same protruding eyes, those same 4 fingers, and hair that defies the laws of physics by growing straight upward in a rigid tower that has maintained its exact shape for 36 years without ever changing, without ever being cut, without ever responding to gravity the way hair is supposed to respond to gravity. Marge was also, at one point, an employee of the Springfield nuclear power plant herself. She was physically inside that facility, exposed to the same environment, breathing the same air, working near the same violations. And all 3 of her children were conceived and born after both parents had been living in Springfield's contaminated environment for years. Bart, Lisa, Maggie. All born in Springfield, all raised in it, all drinking from the same water supply that produces 3-eyed fish, all breathing the same air that hangs downwind of cracked cooling towers patched with gum. And every one of them displays physical characteristics that do not occur in normal human populations. The spiky hair that maintains its structural integrity without any product, the overbites, the protruding eyes, the yellow skin. Every resident of Springfield is yellow. Not sallow, not pale in an unusual way, not slightly off-color yellow. A vivid, saturated, unmistakable yellow that covers every person in the town and nobody outside it. And here's the detail that makes the radiation theory click into place in a way that is genuinely difficult to argue against. When people come to Springfield from outside, when celebrities appear as guest characters, when characters visit from other towns, they look different. Measurably, observably, anatomically different. Their proportions are more natural. Their eyes sit in their skulls the way eyes are supposed to sit. Their features have a quality that more closely resembles the way human beings actually look. They are drawn with more realistic proportions than the residents of Springfield, and this difference is not subtle. The standard explanation is that this is just the art style of the show. That Springfield residents look a certain way because that's the Simpsons aesthetic, and outsiders are drawn slightly differently to provide visual contrast. But inside the logic of the show's own universe, this explanation collapses immediately. Because the universe of The Simpsons treats its characters as real people living in a real world. Within that world, there is a visible, observable, physical difference between people who live in Springfield and people who don't. The people inside the contamination zone look a specific way. The people outside it look another way. And the difference tracks precisely with the dividing line you'd expect if chronic exposure to radioactive contamination was causing systematic biological mutation in the local population. The animals reflect this too. Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog, has the same protruding eyes as his owners. His proportions deviate from real canine anatomy in the same way the humans deviate from real human anatomy. And Blinky, of course. Blinky is the show drawing you a direct line between the power plant and biological mutation in living organisms. The show says this clearly. Here is a creature that lives in the water downstream from this facility, and here is what the radiation has done to its body. It gave it a third eye. And then the show expects you to believe that this same radiation, produced by this same facility, leaking into this same water supply and this same air, has had zero effect on the humans living in that environment. That the fish mutated and the people didn't. That the dog's eyes are abnormal but the human's eyes are totally fine. That the 342 violations and the decades of dumping and the luminous rats are all just a quirky background detail with no biological consequences for anyone breathing and eating and drinking within a few miles of the source. The show does not believe that. The show has never believed that. The show knows exactly what it's depicting. It just relies on the audience doing the same thing. Springfield's residents do accepting the surface, not asking the follow-up question. Burns knows. This is the part of the radiation theory that transforms it from an interesting fan observation into something genuinely dark. Because Burns doesn't just suspect that his plant is affecting the population. Burns is personally living with the consequences of radiation exposure in his own body, and he has spent enormous resources developing the means to manage it. In the episode known as the Springfield Files, which we will discuss in much more detail when we get to the section on Burns's impossible lifespan, Burns undergoes a weekly medical treatment so intensive, so saturated with chemicals and radiation therapy, that it causes his body to emit a visible green glow. The treatment keeps him alive for exactly 7 more days. Without it, he dies. Burns is not surviving because he's healthy. Burns is surviving because he has access to medical infrastructure that nobody else in Springfield has. He has private physicians. He has a pharmaceutical operation capable of synthesizing experimental treatments. He has the resources to maintain the precise, scheduled medical intervention that keeps his radiation-saturated body in a functioning state. And he understands, in more depth than anyone else in Springfield, exactly what radiation does to biological systems. He understands it because his own biology is a laboratory for that question. He lives it every week, which means Burns knows what his plant is doing to the people of Springfield. He cannot not know. He is managing the effects of radiation exposure in his own body on a weekly basis, with the help of a full medical team, and he is surrounded by a population that has no equivalent support, no equivalent resources, no equivalent access to treatment, and no knowledge that they need any of it. The three-eyed fish is not a mystery to Burns. It's a data point, one he has been collecting and discarding for decades. And Homer's employment fits into this with an uncomfortable precision. When German investors purchased the power plant in one episode, the very first thing they did was fire Homer. The second thing they did was assess the cost of bringing the facility up to code, and they very nearly went bankrupt from the estimate alone. The violations were so numerous, so deeply embedded, so structurally fundamental to the operation of the plant, that addressing them all was essentially equivalent to building a new facility from scratch. Burns bought the plant back and immediately rehired Homer. Not out of affection, not out of loyalty, out of strategy. A competent safety inspector, someone who actually understood the regulations, actually enforced the standards, actually required that violations be corrected, would shut that plant down within days of starting the job. Homer ensures the violations continue. Homer's incompetence is not a liability to Burns. It is an asset. Every donut eaten during a meltdown warning, every nap taken at the control panel, every protocol ignored in favor of a more comfortable approach, all of it serves Burns's interests. The plant keeps operating. The leaks keep leaking. The water stays the way it is. And the population stays the way it is, cognitively impaired enough by decades of radiation exposure that they do not look up at the cracked cooling towers and start asking questions. The crayon in Homer's brain deserves a full examination here, because it is one of the most important pieces of evidence the radiation theory has. In season 12, Homer discovers that there has been a crayon lodged in his brain since childhood. The crayon was inserted through his nose at a young age. The show depicts this in a flashback, and it has been physically pressing against his brain tissue ever since, reducing his cognitive function. When the crayon is removed by a doctor, Homer's IQ climbs dramatically. He becomes articulate, perceptive, capable of complex reasoning. He understands the world around him with a clarity that he has never had access to before. And it makes him miserable, because the world around him, seen clearly for the first time, is exactly as dark as the radiation theory suggests it is. Homer can see what Springfield is. He can see what his job actually represents. He can see the architecture of the system he's trapped inside, and it is unbearable to him, so he chooses to have the crayon reinserted. He chooses the fog. He chooses the comfortable numbness of reduced cognitive function over the pain of understanding his own life. But the radiation theory asks a question the show never addresses. How did the crayon get there? How did Homer go through his entire childhood, his entire adolescence, his entire adult life visiting doctors in Springfield, getting medical checkups from Springfield's medical establishment, and not a single physician found a foreign object lodged in his skull? Either every doctor in Springfield is operating at a level of incompetence so extreme it borders on criminal negligence, or the medical establishment in Springfield knows things it isn't sharing. If Burns's influence extends into the healthcare infrastructure of the town he essentially owns, and there is significant canonical evidence that it does, then it becomes worth asking whether Homer's crayon is an accident or whether it has been a managed condition. Whether someone in Springfield's power structure discovered it and decided that a Homer Simpson with a crayon in his brain was considerably more useful than a Homer Simpson without one. The radiation theory doesn't just explain individual mysteries. It explains the architecture of Springfield itself. The characters don't age because their mutated biology has been altered in ways that affect normal cellular processes. The town resets after catastrophic events because the population's capacity for sustained critical thinking has been compromised by chronic neurological damage. Homer survives things that should kill him because his body has been physically adapted by decades of radiation exposure into something that ordinary human biology can't account for. Burns stays alive through treatments that would destroy a normal person because he has spent over a century developing the means to maintain a radiation-saturated body in functional condition. And nobody in Springfield questions any of this, consistently across 36 years of episodes, because the same substance that mutated their bodies has also done something to the part of their brains responsible for the kind of sustained, critical inquiry that would be required to see the pattern. Springfield is not a quirky animated town full of eccentric characters having funny misadventures. Springfield is a contamination zone. The residents are not eccentrics. They are patients who don't know they're patients, living inside a situation they cannot see clearly enough to name, sustained by a system that depends on their continued inability to look up and ask the obvious question. The nuclear power plant isn't part of the show. It is the show. Every yellow face, every protruding eye, every impossible recovery, every forgotten disaster, every reset, every mystery that gets introduced and then quietly dropped before anyone can follow the thread, it all leads back to the same cracked cooling tower, leaking the same invisible material into the same water, feeding the same damaged neurology that can't figure out why the fish have 3 eyes. The plant made sure of that. It has always been making sure of that. And it will keep making sure of that because a population that can see clearly is a population that asks questions. And in Springfield, questions are the one thing that Burns's empire cannot survive. Before we go any further, drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from and what time it is right now. There is something genuinely wonderful about knowing that someone in a completely different time zone is settling in for the same 4 hours of Springfield mysteries. And if you're enjoying this, subscribe. It helps more than you'd think. And there's a great deal more where this came from. Now that the radiation theory is laid out and sitting with you, it's time to introduce something that reframes it completely. Not replaces it, reframes it. Because the two theories we're about to discuss don't contradict each other so much as they orbit the same central mystery from different angles. And when you hold both of them in your mind at once, something strange and sad and unexpectedly beautiful comes into focus. Let's go back to April of 1993, Season 4, Episode 18. The title is So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show. The premise is entirely straightforward on the surface. It's April Fool's Day, and Bart is running pranks on Homer, each one escalating beyond the last. The final prank involves taking one of Homer's beer cans to an auto body shop and placing it inside an industrial paint shaker. The can is shaken until the pressure inside is extraordinary. Bart puts it back with Homer's other cans, and Homer, being Homer, opens it without a second thought. The explosion is described as violent. Homer is sent to the hospital. This is the comedic setup, and the show plays it that way. But what happens next shifts the episode's register in a way that, if you're paying attention, is genuinely unsettling. Homer, lying in his hospital bed and recovering from the explosion, sees a vending machine across the room. He wants a candy bar. He reaches for it, and the machine tips forward and crushes him. And Homer Simpson, the man who has shrugged off gunshot wounds and cliff falls and industrial accidents, flatlines. He enters a coma. A real, clinical, documented coma, not a dream sequence, not a cutaway gag, not a temporary unconsciousness played for a laugh. The show uses the medical term and treats the event with a weight that distinguishes it from the usual Homer suffers and recovers structure. The coma lasts 7 weeks within the episode. Bart sits at Homer's bedside. The family waits, and then, apparently, Homer wakes up. Bart tearfully confesses. Homer immediately reaches up and begins strangling him. The family laughs. The episode ends. And The Simpsons continues for 32 more years. Except here is what the show tells you in the final moments of that episode, tucked into the resolution almost as a footnote. Homer lost 5% of his brain function during the coma. 5%. Permanently. Gone. Never coming back. Destroyed by the weeks of clinical unconsciousness. And Homer's response when he's told this, when he's told that he has suffered a permanent, irreversible reduction in his cognitive capacity, is to laugh. He laughs, and he says he doesn't understand why he's laughing. And the family finds this charming, and the episode ends. Nobody finds it alarming. Nobody treats the permanent brain damage as the serious medical development it actually is. The show gives you this information, lets Homer laugh about it, and then moves on to the next episode as if nothing of consequence has occurred. Unless nothing did occur. Unless Homer, when that vending machine fell, never actually came back. This is the Homer coma theory. It is the most widely discussed, most extensively debated, and most internally consistent fan theory in the entire history of The Simpsons. Its origins are generally attributed to a post made by a Reddit user, and the basic premise, stated simply, is this. Homer Simpson did not wake up from his coma in April of 1993. Every single episode that has aired since that date, every storyline, every character development, every celebrity appearance, every impossible event, every reset, every moment that defied logic and physics and the basic rules of the world, the show established in its early seasons is a dream. A dream being generated by the unconscious mind of a man lying in a hospital bed in Springfield General, slowly losing brain function while his family sits beside him and waits. The evidence is extensive enough that going through it carefully takes some time. Let's do that. The first and most structurally significant piece of evidence is the tonal shift. Before the coma episode, before April of 1993, in the first 4 seasons of the show, The Simpsons was a grounded program. Not realistic in the sense of kitchen sink drama, not a show without comedy or absurdity, but a show whose emotional and narrative core was built on recognizable human problems depicted through the lens of satire. Homer struggles with his weight and his self-esteem. Marge considers the possibility of an emotional connection with another man. Lisa develops a crush on a substitute teacher and has her heart quietly broken. Bart faces the real possibility of academic failure severe enough to hold him back a year. These are the kinds of things that real families experience. The comedy in those early episodes comes from the specificity of the observation, from the way The Simpsons take ordinary domestic anxieties and render them with enough exaggeration to be funny but enough truth to land emotionally. After the coma, this changes. The shift is not a gradual drift. It is a seismic rupture in the texture of the show. Homer goes to space. Homer discovers his mother is alive and has been a fugitive radical for decades. Homer becomes the leader of a vigilante group. Homer joins a secret society. Homer meets God, more than once. Homer travels internationally on a regular basis. Homer holds dozens of entirely different jobs across different industries and somehow maintains employment at the power plant throughout all of it. The show transforms from a domestic satire grounded in economic anxiety and middle-class reality into something that is essentially picaresque, a series of increasingly surreal adventures experienced by a man who seems to be exempt from ordinary consequences. The internet has spent 20 years debating when exactly The Simpsons declined in quality, which seasons represent the show's peak, and where the fall began. The coma theory has a precise and specific answer to all of those questions. The Simpsons didn't get worse after season 4. Homer's brain got worse after season 4. The increasing surrealism, the escalating absurdity, the erosion of internal consistency, the way the show gradually detaches from any recognizable version of reality, all of it follows the trajectory you would expect from a dreaming brain that is slowly deteriorating. The early coma episodes are vivid and almost coherent, close to the world Homer knew before he went under. As the years pass, as the damage deepens, the dream becomes stranger. The physics bend further. The coincidences multiply. The celebrities appear with increasing frequency. The stakes become simultaneously higher and less meaningful. It's exactly what you'd expect from a mind that is running out of the infrastructure required to maintain a coherent simulation. 6 months before the coma episode aired, in the season 4 premiere, an episode called Homer the Heretic, Homer has a face-to-face conversation with God, an actual conversation. God appears to Homer in a dream and speaks to him directly, and in the course of that conversation, God tells Homer something specific. He tells Homer that Homer will eventually learn the meaning of life. But not yet. God says Homer's time is coming. 6 months later, Homer is in a coma. Read that sequence again. God tells Homer, in the season 4 premiere, that his time is coming. And 6 months later, Homer's conscious life ends. The show presents the conversation as a quirky theological gag, which is entirely consistent with how The Simpsons handles religious content. But inside the framework of the coma theory, that exchange reads as something else entirely. God was telling Homer that his waking life was nearly over, that the clock was running out, that everything that came after would be something different from the life Homer had been living. The aging problem is the piece of evidence that the coma theory handles most elegantly, and it is the piece that every other theory struggles with. Nobody in Springfield ages. Bart has been 10 years old for 36 years. Lisa has been 8. Maggie has been 1. Homer and Marge show no signs of physical aging despite the passage of multiple real-world decades. The floating timeline, which we'll examine in full in a later section, keeps the present eternally present and the characters eternally frozen. Every theory about The Simpsons has to grapple with this fact and offer some explanation for it. The radiation theory says the mutation has altered their biology. The cartoon logic explanation says it's simply a convention of animated series. But the coma theory has the simplest answer of all, and it happens to be the most emotionally devastating one available. Nobody ages because they exist inside the mind of a man who went to sleep in April of 1993 and has not woken up since. Of course, his children don't age. His unconscious brain can't imagine them growing up, because he wasn't there to see it happen. His wife doesn't age because the last time he saw her, she looked exactly like that. His friends don't change because his memory of them is fixed at the moment the vending machine fell. The dream preserves his world exactly as it was on the day he lost it, because that is what the unconscious mind does when it is sealed inside a coma. It locks you in place. It freezes the world at the last moment you experienced it, and it runs simulations of that world using only the reference material available at the time of the lock. Every episode since April of 1993 is Homer's brain running those simulations, over and over, using a dataset that stopped updating the moment he went under. The celebrity appearances fit into this framework with a precision that feels almost too neat, and yet the logic is sound. Homer's brain, lying in a hospital bed, is not sealed off from the world around it. The brain in a coma continues to receive sensory input, ambient sounds from the room, voices from the television left on in the background, music from a radio, fragments of conversation from family members sitting at the bedside. Homer's brain is receiving this input continuously across the weeks and months and years of his unconsciousness. It hears names, it hears voices, it absorbs fragments of cultural reference, and it incorporates all of it into the dream. This is why later seasons of The Simpsons are flooded with celebrity guest appearances in a way that early seasons simply weren't. Springfield didn't become a magnet for famous people. Homer's brain started absorbing more ambient media as the coma extended, and that media began feeding into the dream with increasing frequency. Every celebrity who shows up in Springfield is a voice Homer heard through the fog of unconsciousness, a name his family mentioned, a face on the television his family left playing in his room, translated into a dream character by a mind that is trying desperately to keep the simulation populated and running. There is canonical evidence for the theory inside the show itself, and it is worth spending some time on because it's extraordinary that the show went here at all. In season 34, an episode called Lisa the Boy Scout includes what was presented as a leaked, deleted scene, a sequence in which Homer wakes up from a long coma and reveals that every outlandish episode was just a dream. The show's writers created this scene, animated it fully, and then presented it as a hoax, a sequence planted in the episode by fictional hackers as a prank. The show says, explicitly, this isn't real, it was a joke. But the writers made it. They sat down and wrote a scene where Homer wakes up from a coma, and everything since season 4 is revealed to be a dream. They animated that scene with the full resources of the production. They put it in an episode, and then constructed an elaborate in-universe explanation for why it doesn't count. They showed you the answer, and then told you it was a fake. And the audience laughed, because Homer's brain laughed when it was told it had lost 5% of itself. Executive producer Al Jean addressed the theory directly in 2015. His response was brief and dismissive. It isn't true, it's fan speculation. But what Jean didn't address in that dismissal is worth noting. He didn't explain the tonal shift. He didn't explain why nobody ages. He didn't explain God's specific warning 6 months before the coma. He didn't explain why the show becomes progressively more surreal and disconnected from ordinary reality with each passing season, at exactly the rate you'd expect from a deteriorating dreaming brain. He said it wasn't true, and the interviewer moved on. The theory does something that no official explanation has ever managed. It makes the show cohere, all of it. The aging freeze, the tonal rupture, the celebrity flood, the increasingly cartoonish plots, the reset button between episodes, the way Homer can survive anything, all of it resolves into a single, internally consistent explanation. Nothing is actually happening to Homer's body. His body is in a hospital bed, only his mind is in Springfield, and his mind cannot let the story kill him because his mind is the one telling the story. He cannot die inside the dream because dying would mean waking up. And waking up, if he can still wake up, means confronting questions he cannot bear to face. How much time has passed? How old are Bart and Lisa and Maggie now? Did Marge wait? Is she still in that room? In the chair beside his bed? Or did she eventually go home, eventually rebuild, eventually build a life around his absence? These are the questions the dream protects Homer from. The dream keeps Bart 10 and Lisa 8 and Maggie 1. The dream keeps Marge exactly as she was. Her hair the same impossible blue tower, her patience the same bottomless resource it has always been. The dream keeps everything intact because the alternative, finding out what the world actually looks like after 36 years of a coma, is something Homer's brain cannot generate without destroying itself. And here is the part of this theory that stays with you long after you've closed the thread and turned off the screen and tried to go to sleep. If the coma theory is correct, then the emotional core of The Simpsons is not comedy. It is one of the most devastating depictions of love in the history of the medium. Homer's deepest, most desperate wish, the thing his unconscious mind reaches for across decades of dreams, is so simple it breaks something open when you really look at it. He wants his family. That is the entire wish. He wants Marge to still love him. He wants Bart to still be his mischievous, exhausting, wonderful little boy. He wants Lisa to still be playing her saxophone in her room. He wants Maggie to still be small enough to hold. He wants Friday night at the house on Evergreen Terrace to last forever. And in the coma, it does. The dream gives him everything. His children preserved exactly as he remembers them. His wife exactly as he loves her. His life running on a loop that always comes back to the same couch, the same television, the same family, the same house. Homer's coma is not a nightmare. It is the only paradise a man like Homer Simpson would ever think to ask for. A house on Evergreen Terrace where the kids are always young and the beer is always cold, and nobody ever has to say goodbye. Every time Homer survives something impossible in a later episode, every time the world resets between episodes as if nothing catastrophic just occurred, every time the credits roll and everything goes back to exactly what it was. That is not lazy writing. That is Homer's brain refusing to let the story end. Because if the story ends, if the simulation finally loses coherence, then something happens. Either Homer wakes up and has to face what's real, or he stops dreaming entirely. And either outcome means the family on Evergreen Terrace disappears. The version of Bart who is still 10, the version of Lisa who still plays saxophone with a ferocity that hasn't been worn down yet, the version of Marge who is still there, all of it goes. So the dream keeps running. Season after season, episode after episode, the dream keeps running. Springfield gets stranger, the plots get wilder, the laws of physics bend further, Homer meets more presidents and travels to more countries and survives more impossible things. Because a brain that has been dreaming for 30 years runs out of the coherence it needs to maintain a grounded reality. It starts reaching for whatever it can find. But it never loses the core. The family is always there. Homer always makes it home. The house on Evergreen Terrace is always waiting. That's what the coma theory says The Simpsons is. Not a comedy, a love letter. An unconscious father dreaming about his family because they are the only thing in the world worth dreaming about. And every episode you've ever watched, every joke you've ever laughed at, every moment that moved you or delighted you or made you feel something, all of it is a man in a hospital bed, somewhere in Springfield, holding on. The summer of 1995 was a specific moment in American television. The kind of moment that doesn't happen often, where a single fictional event captured enough of the collective cultural imagination that it transcended the medium entirely and became something else. A national conversation, a shared puzzle, a mystery that people were genuinely invested in solving. And the mystery was this: someone shot Mr. Burns. Let's go back to the beginning properly, because the setup matters as much as the resolution, and the resolution, the official one, the one the show committed to, is considerably more complicated than it appears. Season 6, Episode 25, Who Shot Mr. Burns? Part 1. This was the season finale of Season 6, and it represented something that had simply never been attempted by an animated series before. A genuine, meticulously constructed whodunit cliffhanger. Not a parody of one, not a joke about the format, a real mystery, with real suspects, real motives, real clues, and a real invitation to the audience to participate in solving it. Fox promoted the episode like a cultural event. America's Most Wanted produced a tie-in special, treating the fictional shooting of a fictional billionaire as though it were an actual unsolved crime requiring public assistance. The show was offering actual prizes to people who could identify the shooter from the clues in the episode alone. The context of the shooting is worth establishing clearly, because the motive landscape is one of the most important aspects of the mystery. In the lead-up to the shooting, Burns had done something remarkable, even by his standards. He had been systematically destroying the lives of virtually every significant person in Springfield in pursuit of his latest scheme. He had drilled down through the earth beneath Springfield Elementary and stolen an oil well that had been discovered under the school grounds. A well whose profits would have restored the school's gutted budget and transformed the educational opportunities available to Springfield's children. He took it for himself. He had financially devastated Moe's Tavern, forcing Moe into bankruptcy and taking away one of the few community spaces Springfield had. He had created a sinkhole beneath the Springfield Retirement Castle, destroying the building where Grandpa Simpson and dozens of other elderly residents lived. He had injured Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog, in the course of one of his operations. And for his final act in the lead-up to the shooting, he constructed a massive mechanical disc and positioned it to block the sun over the entire town of Springfield. Not figuratively, Burns stole the sun. He blocked the light. He plunged Springfield into artificial darkness so that every resident of the town would be forced to purchase electricity from his power plant, removing their option to use solar energy and cementing his monopoly permanently. He stole the sun from the people of Springfield and then sent his assistant away when that assistant, Smithers, who has remained loyal to Burns through every conceivable moral compromise, finally said, "This has gone too far and I will not help you." Burns fired Smithers on the spot. By the end of Part 1, every significant character in Springfield had a specific, documented, personal reason to want Burns dead. Homer, because Burns had been unable to remember his name despite Homer working for him for years, a humiliation that had finally reached a breaking point. Bart and Lisa, because the stolen oil well had cost their school its funding. Grandpa Simpson because the retirement castle had been destroyed. Groundskeeper Willie, who had lost his job in the chaos. Tito Puente, who had lost the music program Burns cut. Mo, who had lost his bar. Even Smithers, freshly fired, publicly humiliated, spiraling into alcoholism, and carrying decades of unexpressed devotion that had just been explicitly rejected. The entire town gathered at a public meeting to confront Burns. The tension in the room was visible and specific. The show took care to depict multiple characters holding or reaching for weapons. Burns arrived at this meeting apparently unafraid, apparently convinced that no one in Springfield would actually act on any of their anger, apparently wrong. A shot was fired. Burns staggered from the building. He made it to the town sundial, and he fell onto it, his hands landing on two letters, W and S, from the perspective of someone looking at him, or M and S, from Burns's own perspective as he lay there, looking up. He was loaded into an ambulance. The screen went dark, and America waited through an entire summer to find out who pulled the trigger. Here is what the show told us when the answer finally arrived. Part 2 opens the following season in September, and it plays out as a comedic procedural. Smithers confesses, immediately collapses under questioning, and admits to the whole thing, and then his confession falls apart when the investigation establishes that he was completely blackout drunk at the time of the shooting, and had actually shot someone else entirely. He shot old Jasper in his wooden leg, not Burns. Wrong location, wrong time, wrong weapon. Smithers is eliminated as a suspect by his own alibi, which is that he was too intoxicated to have done what he confessed to doing. One by one, suspects are eliminated. Alibis are confirmed. The investigation stalls until a piece of physical evidence is found, an eyelash on Burns's suit jacket. DNA analysis is run. The eyelash belongs to a Simpson. Fingerprints are found on the weapon. They belong to Homer. Homer had the clearest motive of anyone in town. He is arrested. He is about to be convicted. And then Burns wakes up from his own coma, a detail worth holding on to, given what we just discussed in the previous section, and identifies his shooter. It was Maggie, baby Maggie Simpson, 1-year-old, who, according to Burns, encountered him in the parking lot after the meeting, attempted a struggle over a lollipop, caused Burns's gun to fall from its holster, then picked it up and discharged it. Case closed. The baby did it, move on? Except the case was never actually closed, and the more carefully you look at the official answer, the more questions it generates. Start with the contest itself, because this detail is extraordinary and tends to get overlooked in discussions of the mystery. Fox invited viewers across America to submit their guess for who shot Burns, with the prize being appearance as an animated character in a future episode. Thousands upon thousands of entries came in. According to the DVD commentary for the episodes, not a single person in the randomly selected review sample submitted the correct answer. Nobody won. The person who received the prize was selected at random from the pool, and because they had not guessed correctly, they received a cash payment rather than being animated. The show's writers acknowledged on that same commentary that they were aware of exactly one person who had posted the correct answer online on a Simpsons news group on the night the original episode aired. But this person was using a college internet account, and by the time the contest concluded and the producers tried to locate them, the account was inactive. They could not find the one person who had identified Maggie. They even included an open invitation on the DVD release for that person to come forward. As far as anyone knows, that person never did. Think carefully about what this means. The show's creators designed a mystery and told the public it was solvable from the evidence presented in Part 1. They built a national promotional campaign around that claim. And when the answer was revealed, essentially nobody who engaged with the mystery in good faith had arrived at the correct conclusion. Either the clues were insufficient, or the red herrings were so effective they overwhelmed the actual evidence, or the answer did not follow logically from the material the show provided despite the show's explicit claim that it did. Now look at the clues themselves. Burns falls on the sundial, and his hands point to the letters W and S, or, from his perspective, M and S. The show tells us this points to Maggie Simpson, M for Maggie, S for Simpson. But Burns himself stated, clearly and on the record within the episode, that the positioning of his hands on those letters was not intentional. He did not deliberately arrange himself to spell out his attacker's initials. He simply fell, and his hands landed where they landed. The sundial clue, the single most prominent piece of evidence that the show uses to justify the official answer, was explicitly described by the victim as a coincidence. Burns said it wasn't a clue. He said he just fell. And the show built the resolution of its mystery around a piece of evidence that the central figure in that mystery told you was meaningless. The gun is another problem. Burns carried a firearm in a holster. In the episode before the shooting, his holster is shown to be empty. The gun was already missing from his person before the attack occurred. Whoever shot Burns used Burns's own weapon, a weapon they had to have either taken from him at some earlier point or found after it had somehow left his possession. This fact shapes the profile of the shooter considerably. Most of the characters at the town meeting came with their own weapons, because they were angry enough about what Burns had done to bring weapons specifically in case things escalated. The person who shot Burns with Burns's own gun was therefore someone who was not independently armed, someone who did not plan to shoot anyone, who had no weapon of their own, who encountered the gun by chance and acted on impulse. A baby finding a gun on the ground fits this profile. So does a significant number of other characters, including several with much stronger documented motives. Then there are Burns's last words before the shooting. His last words, according to the official account, were, "Oh, it's you." Not a cry of surprise, not a startled exclamation. A calm, mild expression of recognition, the kind of thing you say when you encounter someone you know, someone expected, someone who registers in your mind as familiar rather than threatening. Does Mr. Burns know Maggie Simpson? Has he ever interacted with her in any meaningful way prior to this episode? The show does not establish a relationship between Burns and the Simpson baby. Burns barely recognizes Homer, and Homer works for him. The idea that Burns would look at a 1-year-old child in a parking lot and say, "Oh, it's you," the way you'd greet a familiar acquaintance, does not square with a man who cannot remember the name of his own employee. Season 18 contains a moment that the show has never adequately addressed. Homer, in casual conversation, claims that he was the one who shot Burns. He says it plainly, on camera, and nobody in the scene reacts. Nobody investigates. Nobody reopens the case. The richest man in Springfield was shot. Homer confesses to the shooting, and the show treats it as a throwaway line that is either a joke or an irrelevant detail. If Homer is lying for attention, which is consistent with his character in many contexts, the line means nothing. But if the original verdict was wrong, if Homer is the actual shooter and has been carrying that knowledge across 18 seasons, then the line means everything. It means a baby was blamed for a crime her father committed. It means the evidence that supposedly proved Maggie's guilt was either manufactured, misinterpreted, or both. It means the greatest mystery in Simpsons history was resolved with a cover-up rather than an answer. There is an alternative theory, well constructed and argued extensively online, that places Marge as the real shooter. The case for this interpretation is stronger than it initially appears. Marge watched Burns destroy her children's school, injure her family's dog, steal the sun from her town, and ruin her community. She had comprehensive motivation. But the key piece of the Marge theory is not the motive, it's Burns' behavior after the shooting. In an earlier episode, Burns had developed an infatuation with Marge, a genuine fixation that the show depicts as one of the few emotional responses Burns has ever had to another human being that isn't contempt or opportunism. He was, in the language of the show, in love with her. The Marge theory proposes that Burns recognized his shooter in that parking lot, "Oh, it's you," and made a decision. Not to protect himself, but to protect her. He took the bullet, survived, woke up from the coma, and rather than name the woman he'd been in love with, pointed to the sundial and let the town draw its own conclusions from an ambiguous arrangement of letters. Maggie became the answer because Maggie was convenient. A 1-year-old child cannot be prosecuted. Chief Wiggum says this explicitly. No jury in the world would convict a baby. The real shooter walks free. The case is closed. And the most dangerous possible suspect, the one whose conviction would destroy the Simpson family, is protected by the immunity that only an infant could provide. The show produced a complete alternate ending in which Smithers is the shooter, fully animated, fully voiced, fully produced. This ending was shown in a clip show episode hosted by the fictional actor Troy McClure, who dismisses it by saying it wouldn't have made sense because all the DNA evidence pointing to a Simpson would have had to be ignored, which would be, in his words, downright nutty. And then he makes a direct reference, explicit and unmistakable, to the O.J. Simpson trial, where a jury ignored DNA evidence to reach an acquittal. The show is winking. It's telling you that ignoring DNA evidence is something that happens. It's telling you that official verdicts and accurate conclusions are not the same thing. It's telling you that the people in power can make the evidence point wherever they need it to point. An early draft of the script had Barney Gumble as the shooter. The writers cycled through multiple possible answers before arriving at Maggie, which means the answer was not determined by the clues. The clues were adjusted to fit whatever answer the writers eventually chose. The mystery was reverse-engineered. And a mystery that is reverse-engineered from a predetermined conclusion is not a fair mystery, it is a performance of one. The official answer is Maggie. The show has committed to this. The DVD commentary treats it as settled. But the contest that nobody won, the clues that Burns himself described as coincidental, the alternate endings that were fully produced, Homer's unexamined confession 18 seasons later, and the final image of Maggie reenacting the shooting alone in an empty room after checking that nobody was watching, all of it points to the same uncomfortable conclusion. The greatest mystery in the history of The Simpsons was never solved. It was closed, and in Springfield, those are two very different things. This is not a rhetorical question, and it is not a piece of comic exaggeration about cartoon logic. Within the established canon of The Simpsons, Charles Montgomery Burns is a medical impossibility. His age has been stated, implied, and contradicted across dozens of episodes, but every reading of the available information places his birth somewhere in the late 1800s. He has described personal memories from before the turn of the 20th century. He has referenced the Gilded Age not as history but as personal experience. He worked with Howard Hughes. He attended Yale. He served in some capacity during the Second World War. His role therein, described by the show as morally questionable, at best, he stole a $1 trillion bill from the United States government during the war and held on to it for decades. He has spoken of the Spanish-American War as something he witnessed firsthand. By the most conservative estimate, Burns is well over 100 years old. By the most expansive reading of the show's internal chronology, he might be approaching 140. And he does not merely exist at this age, he functions. He operates a multi-billion-dollar corporation with strategic precision. He manipulates municipal politics. He engineers schemes that require long-term planning, sustained attention, and a working understanding of modern finance and modern law. His body is visibly frail. Yes, his physical strength is almost non-existent, and the show frequently depicts him as barely capable of basic physical tasks. But his mind is sharp. Burns is arguably the most cognitively capable character in Springfield, operating with a strategic ruthlessness and a clarity of purpose that no one in town can match. And he has been operating at that level for longer than any human being has any business sustaining consciousness. The show addresses the question of how he's still alive directly in the Springfield Files, the X-Files parody episode where Homer sees a glowing figure in the woods and the town panics about alien contact. The resolution, as mentioned earlier, is that the figure is Burns, wandering through the forest in a dazed and euphoric state following his weekly medical treatment. The treatment is so intensive, so chemically and radiologically saturated, that it causes his entire body to emit a visible green glow. And the critical detail, the treatment keeps him alive for exactly 7 more days. Without it, he dies. The margin for error is 0. One missed dose, and Burns's biological systems fail. His life is maintained the way you maintain a complex machine through scheduled servicing. He is not surviving through any natural biological process. He is being kept alive through a recurring intervention that must be administered on a precise weekly schedule, and that intervention involves radiation. The man who owns a nuclear power plant, whose facility has been leaking radioactive material into Springfield's environment for decades, is personally dependent on controlled radiation exposure to sustain his own biological functions. He is not just profiting from the nuclear industry, he is powered by it. His body has been so fundamentally altered by his proximity to nuclear material across more than a century that it can no longer sustain itself through normal cellular processes. He requires external radiation input the way a healthy body requires food and water. This explains something the show has depicted multiple times and never fully addressed: the state of Burns's immune system. In one of the most quoted scenes in the series, Burns visits a doctor who delivers the results of a comprehensive medical examination. The verdict is that Burns has every disease known to medical science simultaneously. Every single illness. all of them, present in his body at the same time, existing in a state of perfect equilibrium, each disease canceling out the effects of every other disease, creating a biological gridlock in which nothing can progress to a fatal stage because everything is competing equally with everything else. The doctor calls it Three Stooges syndrome. Three stooges trying to walk through a doorway at once. None of them can get through. Burns's diseases are all trying to kill him at the same time. None of them can because they're all blocked by each other. This is played as a joke. It is one of the most memorable jokes the show has ever made. But under the radiation theory, it is something else entirely. Burns's body is not maintaining this equilibrium through any natural process. The weekly radiation treatments are doing it. They don't cure the diseases, they manage them. They keep every illness in a state of precisely calibrated stasis, balanced against every other illness, preventing any single condition from gaining enough dominance to actually kill him. It is not medicine in any conventional sense. It is nuclear maintenance. Burns's body is a reactor, and his weekly treatments are the equivalent of adjusting the control rods to prevent a meltdown. Smithers is central to this. Smithers is not just a devoted assistant who manages Burns's affairs and maintains his schedule out of loyalty and something that looks very much like love. Smithers is the single person who fully understands how Burns's medical protocol works, who ensures that the appointments are kept, who monitors Burns's physical condition with a vigilance that borders on obsession. And the show has established repeatedly, across many episodes, that if Smithers were to leave, if he were removed from his position or chose to walk away, Burns would be helpless. Not emotionally helpless, physically helpless. Without Smithers managing the treatment schedule, Burns would miss a dose. Without that dose, the disease equilibrium would collapse. Every illness in his body would surge forward simultaneously, and Burns would die within a week. Smithers's devotion is not simply an expression of deep personal attachment to a man who treats him poorly. It is the devotion of someone who knows that his absence is a death sentence. He is the infrastructure that keeps Burns alive. He is the maintenance schedule. He is the only person in Springfield who knows precisely what Burns actually is, and what Burns needs, and what happens if that need goes unmet. And that knowledge, that specific, irreplaceable knowledge, is the foundation of the entire relationship. Burns keeps Smithers because Smithers is necessary. Smithers stays because he knows that leaving would kill a man, and whatever his complicated feelings about Burns as a person and an employer, he cannot bring himself to do that. Burns's relationship with historical events adds a layer to the immortality question that goes beyond simple biology. The show has depicted Burns interacting with or referencing an extraordinary number of historical figures and events spanning from the late 1800s to the present day. He knew Howard Hughes personally. His Yale education places his young adulthood in the early 20th century. His service during the Second World War, whatever form that service actually took, situates him as a functioning adult in the 1940s. He has referenced the Gilded Age as personal experience, has described the early industrial era from the perspective of someone who lived through it and helped shape it. The Burns family dynasty extends the question further. The show has depicted the Burns family as one of the oldest continuously powerful lineages in American history, not just wealthy in the ordinary sense, but the kind of wealth that predates industrial capitalism, that built the infrastructure others then paid to use, that has been compounding and accumulating across generations long enough that the current Burns inherited an empire rather than built one. And the question the show never answers is whether the current Burns is unique in his longevity, or whether the Burns dynasty has always found ways to extend the lifespan of its patriarchs beyond what ordinary biology would allow. Before nuclear medicine, before the specific interventions that currently keep Burns alive, did the Burns family of the 19th century or the 18th century employ other means? The show doesn't say, but the fact of their continuous, uninterrupted control of their fortune across such an extended period of time suggests that either they have been extraordinarily fortunate in terms of generational succession, or they have had access to resources and methods that the rest of the population has not. Continuous dynasties of this kind are historically anomalous. They require either extraordinary luck or extraordinary measures. Burns's relationship with death itself, the direct, personal, physical relationship, is one of the most remarkable patterns in the entire run of the show. Burns has come closer to dying than almost any other character in the series. He's been shot by a baby. He has been hospitalized dozens of times across dozens of episodes. He has collapsed, fallen, been physically attacked, been exposed to poisons, been abandoned in wilderness environments. He has survived things that would kill an ordinary person multiple times over. And every time, he comes back. Not through the cartoon resilience that Homer displays. Homer endures damage and heals through the show's physical comedy logic. Burns comes back through infrastructure, through money, through the machinery of extreme wealth that ensures, no matter what happens to his physical form, there will always be someone standing by with the resources and the knowledge to put him back together. Homer's immortality, under the frameworks we've been discussing, is passive. The coma dream keeps him alive because the dream needs him alive. The radiation mutation makes his body resilient because the show requires him to be resilient. Homer survives because the narrative requires it. Burns survives because he has spent over a century building a system specifically designed to ensure his survival, regardless of what happens to his physical form. Every dollar he has ever spent, every institution he has ever corrupted, every politician he has ever purchased, every doctor he has ever retained with resources that exceed what those doctors have ever earned in their careers, every piece of medical research he has privately funded, all of it in aggregate serves one purpose: keep Burns alive, keep the treatments coming, keep the equilibrium maintained, keep the reactor running. His entire empire is ultimately a life support system. The power plant and the pharmaceutical research, and the political influence, and the personal staff of physicians, and the unfailing loyalty of Smithers, all of it is the mechanical underpinning of one man's refusal to die. And Springfield needs him to refuse to die. This is the most disturbing part of the Burns immortality theory. The town's economy is built around the power plant. The power plant requires Burns. Burns requires his medical treatments. His medical treatments require the infrastructure that his wealth provides. It is a closed loop, a self-sustaining system in which the man, the machine, and the money all feed each other in a cycle that has no natural ending point. Springfield cannot kill Burns because Springfield cannot survive without Burns. The lights go off, the jobs disappear, the economy collapses, and Burns cannot die because dying would mean the system he built would finally have to answer for what it has done to the people inside it. The contaminated water, the mutated fish, the yellow skin and the four fingers and the reduced cognitive function of generations of Springfield residents. All of it would come to the surface, all at once, with no living billionaire to absorb the legal liability. Burns staying alive is not just in his personal interest. It is, structurally, in everyone's interest, which is exactly how he designed it. He is the oldest man in Springfield. He may be the oldest man in the United States. He is maintained by weekly radiation treatments that would destroy anyone without his specific biology, sustained by a fortune that predates the nation itself, protected by the only man in Springfield who knows what Burns actually is. And he is surrounded by a population too damaged by decades of his plant's output to question why their employer glows faintly in the dark and remembers a war that ended before their grandparents were born. He is not immortal in any mystical sense. He is something considerably more mundane and considerably more disturbing. He is too expensive to die, and Springfield will keep paying the bill for as long as Burns keeps the lights on. She doesn't talk. She has not talked, in any meaningful or sustained way, in 36 years of episodes. She communicates through pacifier sounds and the occasional pointed stare. She is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old since 1989. She sits in the background of scenes, in the front seat of the family car, in the corner of rooms where the louder members of the family are having their louder problems, and she watches. She watches everything. And in that time, while watching, she has done things that no other member of her family has managed. She shot a billionaire and was not prosecuted. She led a daycare rebellion against a tyrannical caretaker and prevailed. She has saved her family from multiple life-threatening situations. She has demonstrated problem-solving abilities that exceed those of adults with decades more experience and education. She was tested and found to possess an intelligence that the testing apparatus couldn't adequately measure. She has, in quiet and unremarked ways, been the most capable person on Evergreen Terrace for the entirety of the show's run. And she has maintained complete silence through all of it, not because she can't speak, because she has made a decision not to. Let's start with the shooting, because it's the act that defines her in the public imagination, but it is actually the least interesting thing about her. We've already gone through the mystery of who shot Mr. Burns in full. We've examined the evidence and the alternate theories and the ways the official answer doesn't quite satisfy the questions it's supposed to answer. But regardless of whether Maggie pulled that trigger intentionally, or found the gun by accident, or is being used as a convenient fallby for someone with a more sophisticated motive, the aftermath is what the Maggie theory is really about. A baby was identified as having committed an act of violence against the richest man in town. The police investigated. Evidence was examined. And the official conclusion was yes, this infant did this, and there is nothing the justice system can do about it. The town accepted this. The family accepted this. Everyone moved on. But the final image of that episode doesn't let you fully move on. Everyone has left the hospital room. Maggie is alone. She looks around the room carefully, deliberately her eyes moving from one point to another, confirming that she is not being observed. And then she moves her pacifier in a motion that precisely mimics the act of pulling a trigger. That sequence has been analyzed extensively. The show presents it as a kind of confirmation Maggie did it, and here's the moment that tells you she knows she did it. But there's another reading of the same image that is equally supported by what we see on screen. A baby who witnessed an adult commit an act of violence is now, alone and unobserved, repeating the gesture she saw because that is what very small children do with experiences that have made an impression on them. They repeat them. They replay them. They work through what they saw by imitating it in a safe space. Maggie might not be confessing. Maggie might be remembering. She might be the only witness to what actually happened, replaying the moment in the privacy of an empty room because it's the only way her one-year-old mind knows how to process it. The Longest Daycare is the piece of canonical evidence that most completely establishes what Maggie actually is. This is a theatrical short film, 7 minutes, fully animated, released before a feature film in 2012 and nominated for an Academy Award. 7 minutes in which Maggie Simpson, without speaking a single word, demonstrates a level of cognitive function that would be extraordinary in an adult. The setup is simple. Maggie is dropped at a daycare facility and encounters a caterpillar in the process of becoming a butterfly. She wants to protect it. Another infant, Gerald, the baby who serves as Maggie's recurring antagonist across the series, wants to destroy it. What follows is a miniature action sequence in which Maggie outmaneuvers the bully, the daycare staff, and the security systems of the facility, ultimately releasing the butterfly into the world. She does all of this without words. Through observation of her environment, identification of threats, real-time improvisation when plans fail, multi-step execution that requires timing and spatial awareness, and the ability to model other people's behavior accurately enough to predict and counter it. Her body can barely keep up with her mind. She falls. She stumbles. She crawls when her planning requires speed, but her decision-making is precise. Every choice she makes is the correct one given the available information. She is operating at a cognitive level that her physical development cannot support, and she succeeds despite the physical constraints because the quality of her thinking compensates for every limitation her body imposes. There are several episodes across the series in which Maggie's intelligence is directly assessed, and the results are consistent. She tests as extraordinarily gifted, off the charts, beyond what standardized measures can accurately capture. The show plays these moments quickly and doesn't dwell on them. They're jokes, they're quick gags, they're set up for something else. But the pattern they establish is unmistakable. Maggie Simpson, across 36 years of the show, consistently demonstrates cognitive abilities that simply should not be possible in a child who hasn't yet developed language. And she hasn't. That is the defining fact about Maggie that the theory builds on. Her first word, voiced by Elizabeth Taylor in what amounts to a cameo appearance in one episode, was the word daddy. It happened once, in a specific emotional context, and was never repeated or developed. Maggie has gone 36 years without language, without sustained verbal communication, without any of the typical developmental markers that would be expected of a child with her demonstrated level of intelligence. She is surrounded by the most verbally hyperactive family in Springfield. Homer narrates his own life continuously. Marge processes everything through conversation. Bart is in perpetual motion, verbally and physically. Lisa lectures, argues, analyzes, debates, philosophizes, challenges, corrects. The Simpson household is a wall of continuous human noise. And in the center of it, Maggie sits in perfect silence, watching. The theory is that the silence is not a developmental delay or an absence of capability. The silence is a strategy, a strategy developed by a mind intelligent enough to have made a specific observation about her environment and reached a specific conclusion about the optimal way to operate within it. Look at what happens to the intelligent women in the Simpson family. Lisa is brilliant. Everyone in Springfield knows it. And what has that intelligence generated for her across 36 seasons? Isolation, mockery, dismissal by people who find her uncomfortable. Her challenges to authority are consistently punished. Her attempts to improve her community are consistently frustrated by the community's resistance to improvement. Her voice is the loudest in the family and the least heard. Lisa announces herself as the most capable person in the room, and the room responds by making very clear how little that matters. Maggie has been watching this happen since before she could hold her own head up. She has watched her sister fight every day for recognition and receive, consistently, resistance. She has watched the smartest person in the family be overlooked, undervalued, and excluded by a household and a community that rewards compliance and punishes the kind of clear-eyed observation that Lisa cannot stop herself from offering. And Maggie drew a different conclusion from the same evidence. Not Lisa's conclusion, which is to keep fighting regardless of the cost. Maggie's conclusion is the opposite. Silence is power. Invisibility is armor. The less they notice you, the more freedom you have to operate. The less they track your movements, the more movements you can make. Consider the evidence for this interpretation. Every remarkable thing Maggie has ever done has happened below the radar, in the margins, in the spaces where nobody was paying close enough attention to see it coming. Burns was shot, and the investigation focused on every adult with a documented motive, because who pays close attention to a baby? The daycare rebellion succeeded because nobody monitors infants carefully enough to see them organizing. Every moment where Maggie saves the day or demonstrates her extraordinary capabilities is a moment that occurs outside the window of everyone else's attention. And Maggie has ensured that nobody pays close attention to her by maintaining the single most effective disguise available to her. She performs infancy. She presents as exactly what everyone expects her to be: quiet, passive, helpless, dependent on the adults around her for everything. The pacifier stays, the toddling walk stays, the inarticulate sounds stay. Everything that signals baby stays, because as long as it stays, she remains invisible. And invisible is exactly what a mind operating at her level needs to be in Springfield. Connect this to the radiation theory and something interesting happens. If Springfield's contaminated environment creates biological mutations in its residents, and if those mutations express differently across different individuals, then Maggie represents the opposite extreme of the spectrum from Homer. Homer's mutation reduced his cognitive function to a level that the show's creator has stated is 55 on an IQ scale. Maggie's mutation, in the radiation theory's framework, amplified hers to levels that the show's own testing apparatus cannot accurately measure. Same environmental cause, same family. Same water, same air, same cracked cooling towers overhead. But the father's brain was diminished, and the youngest daughter's was enhanced. Two sides of the same radioactive process, producing opposite outcomes. Homer and Maggie are a demonstration of the range of outcomes that chronic radiation exposure can generate in human biology. If the coma theory is the right lens, Maggie's extraordinary capabilities take on a quality that is almost unbearably poignant. If Homer is dreaming, if every episode is the product of an unconscious father's mind reaching for his family, then Maggie's genius is what Homer dreams his youngest child to be. He cannot watch her grow up. He cannot hear her first sustained sentence or see her take her first confident steps or learn what kind of person she becomes as the years pass. He cannot be there for any of it. So in the dream, he makes her already extraordinary. He gives her an intelligence that transcends her age. He makes her capable of things that no one-year-old child could actually accomplish in the real world, because in his unconscious mind, he needs to believe that Maggie will be okay even without him there to protect her. Her genius is not a mutation in the dream. It's a father's prayer, the most specific and tender thing an unconscious mind can do for a child it cannot reach. But in Springfield, in the daylight version, if there still is a daylight version, there's a darker reading. Maggie doesn't speak because she has learned that speaking achieves nothing in this town. She doesn't reveal what she knows and what she's capable of because demonstrating capability is punished here. She has spent 36 years watching, listening, processing, understanding things that no one around her suspects she understands. And she waits, What Maggie is waiting for is the one genuinely unsolved mystery of the Simpson family. The show has never told us. It has shown us glimpses of her capacity, the shooting, the daycare film, the intelligence tests, the moments where her judgment is implicitly trusted by the people around her, but it has never told us what she plans to do with it. Her endgame is unwritten. She is 1 year old. She cannot walk reliably. She has not, in 36 years, developed language beyond a single word spoken once. And she is, by any meaningful measure, the most powerful person on Evergreen Terrace. She has been waiting for her moment for longer than most people have been alive. And when she finally decides to act when the calculation completes, and she concludes that the time is right, nobody will see it coming. Nobody will see it coming because Maggie has spent 36 years making absolutely certain of that. The pacifier stays in, the eyes stay large and apparently vacant, the stumbling walk continues, and something behind all of it watches and thinks and waits. That's the most frightening thing about Maggie Simpson. Not what she has done, what she hasn't done yet. In the 21st century, The Simpsons became famous for something that had nothing to do with any of the mysteries we've been exploring tonight. It became famous, more famous in some circles, than anything the show actually did during its creative peak for appearing to predict the future. For depicting events years or decades before those events occurred, with a specificity and an accuracy that the internet found genuinely difficult to explain away. Let's get the most famous examples on the table first, because you've probably seen them, but they deserve to be examined properly rather than just referenced. In the year 2000, an episode called Bart to the Future depicted a future version of Springfield in which Lisa Simpson has become the first female president of the United States. Lisa, in this future, is dealing with the financial wreckage left by her predecessor in the Oval Office. Her predecessor is identified, explicitly, as Donald Trump. This episode aired 16 years before the 2016 presidential election in which Trump won. 16 years. The show depicted a Trump presidency as a punchline about the absurd direction that celebrity culture and American politics were heading together. And then the punch landed. The internet's reaction was enormous. Screenshots circulated everywhere. People who hadn't watched the show in decades were suddenly sharing clips. The Simpsons predicted Trump became not just a talking point but a genuine piece of cultural shorthand, something people referenced in conversations about the show without ever watching it. The list extends well beyond Trump. In a 1995 episode, the show depicted a device worn on the wrist that functions as a communication and information tool, something that looks, to any modern eye, remarkably like a smartwatch. In a 1994 episode, Homer goes to space alongside a real astronaut, decades before commercial space tourism became an actual industry that wealthy civilians could purchase access to. In a 1998 episode, a Homer who has been made temporarily smarter works through a mathematical problem on a chalkboard, and the equation he writes appears to anticipate the mass of the Higgs boson particle, a value that would not be experimentally confirmed until 2012, when the Large Hadron Collider produced the first direct detection. In a 1999 episode, Homer proposes a theory about the shape of the universe involving a toroidal geometry. Years later, cosmologists found radiation patterns in the cosmic microwave background that some researchers interpreted as potentially consistent with a universe shaped like a torus. A 1993 episode called Marge in Chains depicts a flu virus originating in Asia that spreads to Springfield, causing mass panic, bulk buying of supplies, and a frantic search for a cure or vaccine. The episode aired 27 years before the COVID-19 pandemic. And in the chaos of that fictional outbreak, the town's population accidentally releases a swarm of aggressive insects, killer bees, that adds an additional layer of civic panic to an already destabilized community. In 2020, as the real pandemic was in its early months, a species of Asian giant hornet was identified in the United States for the first time, immediately dubbed murder hornets by media coverage, and the timing felt uncanny to anyone who remembered the episode. In 1996, an episode called Homerpalooza includes a joke about the hip-hop group Cypress Hill somehow accidentally booking the London Symphony Orchestra for the same event. The exact combination Cypress Hill performing live with the London Symphony Orchestra actually happened in 2024 at the Royal Albert Hall. 28 years between the joke and the reality. A 1998 episode depicted the Disney Corporation acquiring the Fox Broadcasting Network, which was the actual network broadcasting The Simpsons at the time. The Fox-Disney merger actually closed in 2019. The show had depicted its own parent company being absorbed by a larger entertainment conglomerate 21 years before it happened. Across multiple episodes throughout the series, the show depicted video calling technology, autocorrect errors in text communication, and pervasive surveillance culture, all of which became defining features of daily life in the 21st century years before smartphones existed in their current form. Before FaceTime was a verb people used, before most people had thought carefully about how much data their devices were collecting. The internet's response to all of this is, every time a new coincidence surfaces, how are they doing this? Are the writers time travelers? Is there some kind of conspiracy? Is there a secret research division? Is The Simpsons receiving information from somewhere that ordinary people don't have access to? The people who actually make the show have a consistent, patient answer to this question, and it is considerably less exciting than any of the theories. Al Jean, who has been an executive producer on the show since its earliest seasons, has addressed the prediction phenomenon directly on multiple occasions. His explanation is direct. If you throw enough darts, some of them are going to be bullseyes. That is the whole explanation. The volume of content across the show's extraordinary run creates a statistical inevitability that some of it will align with future events. Producer Bill Oakley, who ran the show during several of its most highly regarded seasons, put a similar point differently. There are very few cases where the show actually predicted something, mostly it's coincidence, because the episodes are old enough that history tends to repeat itself. Fact-checking organizations have gone through many of the most popular claimed predictions systematically and found that most of them have much simpler explanations than prophecy. The writers didn't predict Trump's presidency. They observed that Trump had been publicly flirting with running for office since at least the late 1980s. He had been taking out full-page newspaper ads, giving interviews about his political ambitions, appearing in ways that were very clearly designed to test public reaction to the idea of him as a presidential figure, and wrote a joke about the logical extreme of a culture that had already started treating celebrity as a substitute for political qualification. They didn't predict the Disney-Fox merger. They were writing satire about media consolidation, which was already an accelerating trend, and extrapolated it to its obvious conclusion. They didn't predict smartwatches. They observed that technology was miniaturizing and becoming more personal, and imagined what a wrist-mounted computer might eventually look like. The writing staff of The Simpsons has, historically, been one of the most formally educated in television. Multiple writers have advanced degrees from Harvard, Yale, and equivalent institutions. A significant number have backgrounds in mathematics, hard science, computer science, economics, and political theory. These are not people making random guesses. They are intelligent, well-read, carefully observant people whose professional work involves studying the trajectory of American culture and society, identifying the patterns within it, and then pushing those patterns to their logical and absurd conclusions. They read the present more carefully than most people do, and they push it forward a few steps. When the future catches up to where they pushed it, it looks like prophecy. All of this is true and accurate, and accounts for the large majority of the supposed predictions. The show's enormous output, the quality of its writing staff's analytical intelligence, the basic statistical reality that 900 episodes of satirical content about American life will inevitably contain material that aligns with later events, and the powerful operation of confirmation bias which causes people to notice and remember and share the hits while not noticing and forgetting and ignoring the many more misses together explain most of what the internet calls the Simpsons prediction phenomenon, but not all of it. This is where the story gets genuinely interesting, because while the debunking is accurate and necessary, it doesn't fully account for certain specific coincidences, and those specific coincidences are worth spending time on. The Trump episode didn't just note that a celebrity businessman had been flirting with politics. It named Trump specifically, depicted him as president specifically, and included a visual sequence of Trump descending an escalator to the enthusiastic reception of supporters, a sequence that visually mirrors, with an uncomfortable precision, the announcement Trump made in June of 2015 when he descended the escalator in Trump Tower to announce his candidacy, surrounded by paid supporters. The show depicted that specific image 15 years before it existed. Not the general concept, the specific image. The Siegfried and Roy episode depicting a white tiger attack on a performer did not simply note that wild animal performances carry risk. It depicted the specific scenario of a white tiger attacking one of the two specific performers. The real attack, in 2003, when Roy Horn was critically injured by one of the act's tigers, matched the episode's scenario in ways that go beyond general trend extrapolation. These examples don't yield easily to the volume and confirmation bias explanation, and the writers themselves have acknowledged this, occasionally and carefully. They sometimes pause when particularly specific coincidences surface. There is something uncomfortable about certain alignments that the standard explanation handles less cleanly than others. And this discomfort opens the door to the most interesting theory about the prediction phenomenon, the one that is more subtle and more intellectually credible than time travel or prophecy, and more unsettling than either. The Simpsons doesn't predict the future. In certain specific and significant cases, The Simpsons shapes it. The show is one of the most watched, most quoted, most culturally embedded pieces of American media in the history of television. It has been running continuously since 1989, longer than most of its current audience has been alive. Its observations, its jokes, its satirical framings of American institutions and American culture have become part of the vocabulary through which Americans understand their own world. When The Simpsons makes a joke about a Trump presidency, that joke enters the cultural bloodstream. It circulates. It becomes a reference point. It makes the idea feel less like a shocking impossibility and more like a punchline that has already been written. When the punchline arrives when reality catches up to the joke, people don't experience it as prediction. They experience it as recognition. We've seen this before. The Simpsons already did this. The show didn't predict Trump becoming president. The show made the idea of Trump becoming president feel, across 16 years of cultural circulation, like an inevitable absurdity rather than an impossible one. And then the inevitability arrived. The same process applies to the Disney-Fox merger. The show's depiction of a massive entertainment corporation swallowing its competitors made media consolidation feel not just possible but obvious for the millions of people who watched it. When the actual merger happened, the response was not shock. It was recognition. Of course they did. The Simpsons already told us this was coming. The satire didn't predict the event. It normalized. The event prepared the cultural imagination for it over decades, so that when it finally happened, it felt familiar rather than strange. This is the mechanism the prediction theory points to. Springfield doesn't reflect America the way a mirror reflects whoever is standing in front of it. Springfield and America have been locked in a feedback loop for 36 years, each influencing the other. The show observes trends in American culture, satirizes them, circulates that satire widely enough that it becomes part of how Americans understand those trends, and in doing so, makes certain outcomes more culturally legible, easier to imagine, easier to accept, easier to ultimately enact. The nuclear power plant in Springfield, the corrupt billionaire who owns it, the incompetent government that fails to regulate it, the population too distracted to notice how badly they're being managed. These were satirical observations about America when the show began. They remain satirical observations. But 36 years of circulation has embedded them in the cultural imagination so deeply that Americans now see their own real-world versions of these things through the lens that The Simpsons provided. The satire didn't predict American institutional dysfunction. It became the vocabulary through which American institutional dysfunction is described and understood. Springfield is not a prediction of where America was headed. Springfield is a diagnosis of where America already was when the show began articulated clearly enough and circulated widely enough that the diagnosis became self-fulfilling in certain respects. And the final piece of the prediction phenomenon, the one that should sit with you a little, is the confirmation bias point. The Simpsons has also made thousands of jokes that didn't come true. Predictions about jetpacks becoming mainstream consumer technology, about moon colonization timelines, about political outcomes that went differently, about cultural shifts that never materialized, about technology that was depicted as imminent and remains, decades later, still not here. Nobody screenshots those. Nobody shares them. Nobody builds theories about the Simpsons' prediction failures. They don't circulate. They're forgotten. Confirmation bias is the most powerful information filter humans have. When something aligns, when a joke from 1998 matches an event in 2024, the alignment is noticed, shared, amplified, discussed, and remembered. When something doesn't align, It's simply gone. The accumulated effect, across 36 years and 900 episodes of content, is a highlight reel that contains only the hits, presented without the context of all the misses that would make the hit rate look considerably less remarkable. The Simpsons didn't write the future. They wrote so many possible futures that some of them were always going to come true, and the ones that came true are the only ones anyone can still find. But try telling that to the internet the next time an episode from 2003 lines up perfectly with a headline from this year. Because even knowing how the trick works, even understanding the volume and the confirmation bias, and the cultural influence mechanism, and the quality of the writing staff's analytical intelligence, it is still impressive to watch. Nearly 900 episodes across 36 years, thousands of satirical observations, and enough alignment with subsequent reality to make even the people who wrote them sometimes pause and wonder whether they know something they're not supposed to know. That wondering is the prediction phenomenon's most lasting achievement. Not the specific coincidences, the doubt. For the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, Homer's mother was dead. That was the official story, established early and never questioned. Abe Simpson, Homer's father, a man the show consistently portrays as unreliable, self-absorbed, and constitutionally incapable of direct emotional honesty, had told Homer that his mother passed away when Homer was young. He had shown Homer a grave. Homer had mourned. He had grown up believing that he was the kind of boy whose mother had left him in the most final and permanent way available, before he was old enough to understand what loss actually meant. That belief shaped Homer's entire personality. His desperate need for approval from anyone who seems willing to offer it. His clinginess toward Marge, the way he orbits her with an intensity that occasionally crosses into neediness, because losing her would mean losing the one thing in his life that feels entirely secure. His terror of abandonment, which runs so deep that he will absorb humiliation, degradation, and outright contempt from his employer, rather than risk the instability that comes from any kind of confrontation. His compulsive desire to be liked by everyone he encounters, which persists even when the people he's trying to please have made it extremely clear that they do not like him and have no intention of starting. Homer Simpson's entire emotional architecture is a coping mechanism for maternal loss. Every quirk, every vulnerability, every moment where his neediness breaks through the comedy, all of it traces back to a little boy who woke up one day and found that his mother was gone. And everything that has been built on top of that loss was built on a lie. Season 7, Episode 7, Mother Simpson. It aired on November 19, 1995. It is, by widespread consensus among critics and longtime fans, one of the greatest episodes the show has ever produced. And it is the episode where the entire architecture of the conspiracy that runs through Homer's life begins to become visible. Here is what happens. Homer, trying to avoid working on a Saturday, fakes his own death in an elaborately stupid way. He pushes a dummy off a cliff near the power plant, and the town believes he's gone. When Marge insists he correct the death record at the Hall of Records, Homer goes in and discovers something in the municipal archives. According to the official records of Springfield, his mother is alive. She is not dead. The grave Abe had shown him was not hers. It was the grave of Walt Whitman, the poet, and Abe had been gesturing at another man's headstone as his wife's burial site for Homer's entire life. The lie was that casual, that careless, that structurally thin. A poet's grave and a man too emotionally avoidant to correct the misapprehension. Homer finds his mother at a cemetery, where she has been visiting what she believes is her son's grave. She heard the false report of his death and came to mourn him. She doesn't recognize him at first. He's changed, grown, become the person he became in her absence, and she last saw him as a small child. But when Homer proves who he is, they have a reunion that is one of the most emotionally raw scenes the show has ever produced. A grown man and his mother, separated for 27 years, finding each other beside a headstone that belongs to neither of them. And then Mona tells him why she left. She didn't die. She didn't leave because she stopped loving him. She left because staying would have put Homer and Abe in danger. Because the man who owns the nuclear power plant, the man Homer would grow up to work for, without ever fully grasping the connection, had destroyed her life and left her no alternative but to disappear. The story begins in 1969. Mona Simpson at that point was a Springfield housewife, married to Abe, mother of a young Homer. An ordinary woman living a quiet life, while the world outside was burning through one of the most turbulent decades in American history. the civil rights movement, the counterculture, Vietnam and the protests against it, and then something shifted for Mona. The show depicts it with the kind of gently absurdist tone it brings to most things, but the underlying substance is entirely serious. She was radicalized. She joined a group of activists, and their target was a facility owned by Mr. Burns, a biological weapons laboratory. Hold that detail. Not the nuclear power plant. A separate facility, also owned by Burns, also located in or near Springfield, designed for the development and storage of biological weapons, weaponized pathogens, germ warfare material. In the same community where families were living their lives, where children were playing, where the ordinary rhythms of a small American town were proceeding without any awareness that the richest man in their community was manufacturing biological weapons in a building nearby. The nuclear power plant's 342 safety violations suddenly seem almost quaint in comparison. Mona and her group broke into the laboratory. They used what the show describes as an antibiotic bomb, a device that would neutralize the biological agent stored inside, rendering it harmless, destroying Burns's weapons stockpile. They executed the plan. The germs were destroyed, and in the chaos of the operation, they accidentally cured the asthma of the security guard who happened to be Clancy Wiggum, the man who would later become Springfield's chief of police, the man who would one day investigate the attempted murder of Mr. Burns himself. The raid succeeded, but Mona made one mistake in the process of leaving. As the group fled the building, she stopped to help someone who had been knocked down in the chaos. And the person she stopped to help was Mr. Burns. She helped him up. He saw her face. He looked directly at her. He identified her, and he reported her to the FBI. From that moment forward, Mona Simpson was a fugitive. She couldn't go home to Abe. She couldn't contact Homer. She couldn't hold the child she had left behind or explain to him, in any way that would reach him, why she was gone. She kissed Homer goodbye while he was sleeping, a detail the show depicts with a quiet devastation that doesn't reach for emotional manipulation but lands anyway and disappeared into whatever underground existence, being a federal fugitive in 1969, made available to her. For 27 years, Homer woke up and his mother was gone. Abe told him she was dead, because telling a small child the complicated truth about a radical mother and a federal manhunt was beyond what Abe was capable of. And Homer spent the next 3 decades believing that there was something fundamentally wrong with him, some essential flaw in his character, some unnameable quality that he had that had made his mother leave rather than stay. Children process maternal abandonment in the most self-referential possible way. If she left, it must be because of something about me. That belief was wrong, completely and entirely, but it had been marinating in Homer's psychology for 27 years before anyone told him so. Now the conspiracy takes its full shape. Burns didn't just identify Mona to the FBI and let the legal system handle it. Burns held a personal grudge against a woman who had destroyed his weapons laboratory, and he spent decades actively pursuing her. When Mona returns to Springfield in the Season 7 episode, Burns recognizes her, almost immediately spots her through a cab window, and contacts the authorities. The FBI arrives at the Simpson house. Mona has to run again. Homer has to watch his mother leave for the second time, knowing this time exactly who is responsible. And he goes to work the next day. He goes to work at the nuclear power plant owned and operated by the man who destroyed his family. He goes to work for the man who identified his mother to federal authorities in 1969 and has been pursuing her ever since. He earns his weekly paycheck from the man who stole his childhood. And Homer doesn't connect the dots in any sustained or actionable way. He doesn't quit. He doesn't confront Burns. He doesn't make the connection between the employer he's passively resented for years and the man his mother had to flee. The show plays this as tragedy rather than comedy, because it is. Homer's inability to see the full architecture of his own situation isn't a joke about his intelligence. It's a consequence of what has been done to him. Because here is the deeper layer of the conspiracy. Burns didn't just ruin Mona's life. The show makes a case, across multiple episodes and pieces of canonical information, that Burns essentially engineered Homer's. By forcing Mona to disappear when Homer was a young child, Burns ensured that Homer would grow up with a specific emotional wound that would make him, decades later, exactly the kind of person Burns needed working in Sector 7G. A man desperate for stability, terrified of abandonment, willing to absorb any amount of degradation from authority rather than risk losing the one secure thing in his life. A man who would never organize, never push back, never threaten the status quo because the status quo, however painful, is less frightening than the alternative of having nothing. Homer doesn't work at the power plant because he lacks ambition or because he's too limited to find better employment. Homer works at the power plant because he was shaped, from early childhood, by a wound that was deliberately inflicted by the man he works for. The damaged version of Homer, emotionally fragile, cognitively impaired, desperate for approval, incapable of sustained resistance, is not an accident of fate. It is the product of a specific choice made by a man who needed a specific kind of worker in a specific kind of job. The Grandpa Simpson angle adds another dimension to this that the show handles carefully. In a later episode, it is revealed that Burns committed a specific crime and Grandpa discovered it. Burns and Grandpa struck a deal. Grandpa's silence in exchange for a guarantee that Homer would always have a job at the plant, regardless of performance, regardless of errors, regardless of any conventional employment metric. 742 documented mistakes by the show's own count, and Homer was never permanently terminated because the deal protected him. The deal that was supposed to help Homer, the deal Grandpa made to secure his son's livelihood, is the same deal that ensures Homer can never leave, can never be fired, can never have the external pressure that might force him to examine the situation more closely. The job security isn't a blessing, it's a leash. Grandpa made a deal with the man who took his wife to guarantee that his son would always be in that man's employ. And the bargain was kept, by both sides, in silence, for decades. While Homer sat in Sector 7G and earned his paycheck from his family's persecutor. Mona Simpson returned one more time after the initial Season 7 episode. She came back to Springfield again in a later season, and this time the show didn't give them a second reunion in the full sense. What it gave them was a death scene. Mona, elderly and ill, dies in Springfield, and Homer sits beside her. He holds her hand. He watches the mother he barely knew slip away. No joke, no reset, no cutaway to something funnier. Just a man and his mother and the accumulated weight of 27 stolen years pressing down on the moment. The Simpsons has always been, underneath the comedy, a show about the way families absorb damage across generations. The way a wound in one generation shapes the next generation, without that generation being fully aware of the shaping. Homer's wound was the loss of his mother. That wound made him the person he is, which made him vulnerable to exactly the kind of exploitation that Burns practices. The damage moved forward in time, from Mona's forced disappearance through Homer's damaged psychology through the specific character of his employment, and Burns stood at the origin point of all of it. Mona fought back and lost everything. She spent 27 years underground, separated from her child, hunted by the FBI at the instigation of a man with unlimited resources and a personal grudge. Abe made a deal with the person responsible for his wife's exile, trading his silence for his son's job security, and never told Homer what he had done or why. And Homer inherited the consequences of both choices without ever fully understanding either of them. 3 generations of a family broken by one man's vendetta, and the man at the center of it kept employing the one who most needed to understand what had happened to him. Burns always wins in Springfield, not because he's lucky, because he has built the system in which the winning occurs, and the people most harmed by that system are the least positioned to see it clearly enough to do anything about it. Homer was never going to figure this out. Not the version of Homer with the crayon in his brain, not the version of Homer who lives downstream from the plant, not the version of Homer whose emotional architecture was shaped by a loss he was never given the real explanation for. He was always going to go to work, always going to eat the donuts, always going to take the paycheck and come home to Evergreen Terrace and sit on the couch and not quite put together what his life actually is. Burns made sure of that when Homer was 6 years old and the house went quiet before sunrise and the mother was gone. Season 9, Episode 2, The Principal and the Pauper. It aired on September 28, 1997, and in the nearly 30 years since, it has not been forgiven. The backlash to this episode was immediate and intense, and remarkably sustained. 27 years later, fans still cite it as the moment when The Simpsons fundamentally betrayed its audience. Critics at the time called it a betrayal of continuity. Harry Shearer, who voices both Principal Skinner and Mr. Burns among other characters, publicly expressed his displeasure with the storyline. It consistently appears at or near the top of lists of the worst episodes in the show's history, which is saying something for a show that has produced close to 900 episodes across nearly 4 decades. But here's what nobody wants to acknowledge about The Principal and the Pauper, which is the correct title that the show gives it despite how it's commonly misremembered. The episode is not bad. The episode is honest. Brutally, uncomfortably, deliberately honest about something that the show had been depicting for years without ever saying out loud. The fans hate it because it shows them something they didn't want to see, but the thing it shows them was always there. Here's what happens. Springfield Elementary holds a ceremony honoring Principal Seymour Skinner's 20 years of service to the school. In the middle of the celebration, a stranger arrives. Nobody recognizes him. He introduces himself as Sergeant Seymour Skinner, the real Seymour Skinner, a decorated Vietnam War veteran who was captured as a prisoner of war and was presumed killed in Southeast Asia. He survived the camp. He found his way home. And he arrived in Springfield to discover that someone else had been living his life. The man Springfield has known as Principal Seymour Skinner is an imposter. His real name is Armand Tamzarian. Before the war, Tamzarian was a juvenile delinquent, a street kid from nowhere, with no family, no prospects, no identity of any value to anyone including himself. He was drafted. He served in Vietnam alongside the real Skinner. And when Skinner was captured and presumed dead, Tamzarian felt guilt. He felt responsible. He traveled to Springfield to deliver the news of Skinner's death to his mother Agnes. But Agnes, when she opened her door, didn't hear the message Tamzarian was there to deliver. She saw a young man standing on her porch, and she assumed he was her son. Come home. She needed him to be her son. She was a woman whose entire emotional life had been organized around a relationship with this one difficult, conflicted, disappointing person. And now someone who resembled him enough, in the right light, at the right moment, had appeared on her doorstep, and Agnes could not bear the alternative. She needed the world to contain a version of her son, Tamzarian, who had never been needed by anyone, who had never had a home, never had a name that meant anything, never had a family or a place in any community, just went along with it. He stepped into the identity that was offered to him. He became Seymour Skinner. He took the name, the rank, the mother, the life. He spent 20 years building the person that Springfield's Principal Skinner was. The military veteran's posture, the complicated relationship with Agnes, the specific dynamic with Bart, the particular professional identity of the school's embattled administrator. He built it all from scratch and made it real, and Springfield accepted it, and he became it, until the real Skinner walked through the gymnasium door and the whole construction collapsed. Now here is where Springfield does something extraordinary. The town holds a meeting. The real Seymour Skinner is present. Armand Tamzarian is present. The truth is fully exposed not as a rumor, not as a suspicion, but as a confirmed, witnessed, acknowledged fact. Everyone in Springfield knows that their principal is a fraud, that the man who has been running their children's school and calling himself Agnes's son and participating in their community for 20 years is not who he has claimed to be. And then Springfield votes, not on whether to prosecute Tamzarian for fraud, not on whether to restore the real Skinner's identity and give him back what was taken from him. Springfield votes on whether to acknowledge the truth at all. The verdict is unanimous. They vote to keep the lie. Judge Snyder issues a legal decree establishing that Armand Tamzarian is now legally and permanently Seymour Skinner. The real Seymour Skinner, the actual man, the war hero who survived captivity in Southeast Asia and came home to find his entire existence occupied by someone else, is tied to the back of a railroad car and physically removed from the city limits of Springfield. And the judge makes it explicitly, legally, formally illegal to ever mention the truth again, under penalty of torture. The show says this plainly. The town collectively decided that their comfort was more important than the truth. They had the evidence. They had the actual person whose identity had been stolen, standing right there. And they chose the fake. They chose the lie. They exiled the truth and criminalized the speaking of it. Fans hated this. They felt it destroyed Skinner's character, retroactively undermined 9 seasons of his established history, and was a cheap, contemptuous trick played on an audience that had invested in the character. And on a certain level, all of these criticisms are fair. The episode does all of those things. It takes something real and replaces it with something constructed, and then asks you to just accept the construction as real now. But that is exactly what Springfield does. That is exactly what this town has always done. That is, in fact, the operational principle of Springfield as a community. The episode didn't break the show. It described the show. It took the mechanism that the Simpsons had been running quietly in the background for 9 years, the collective agreement to forget catastrophes, to reset after world-changing events, to accept the official version of reality over the inconvenient actual version, and it put it on screen, in a public meeting, with legal documents and a railroad car, so you couldn't miss it. Every other time Springfield forgets something enormous, it happens between episodes. The dome comes down. The nuclear near-miss is resolved. The environmental catastrophe is contained. And then the next episode begins. And everything is back to normal with no one referencing what just happened. The show calls this episodic storytelling. Critics call it a lack of continuity. The coma theory calls it a dreaming brain resetting between sleep cycles. The radiation theory calls it cognitive damage from chronic neurological exposure. The Principal and the Pauper offers a fourth explanation, and it is the one most grounded in how actual communities work. Springfield resets because the town chooses to reset, collectively and deliberately, through an unspoken social contract that says, we will not acknowledge what happened. We will maintain the agreed version of reality. We will treat the lie as truth and the truth as criminal, and we will exile anyone who insists on the difference. This is not a cartoon trope. This is how real communities handle existential threats to their self-understanding. Small towns in particular have documented capacities for collective denial about uncomfortable truths. Scandals are buried. The official version of events calcifies into the only version anyone can remember. The person who keeps insisting on what actually happened becomes the problem, rather than the witness. What the Principal and the Pauper does is make this process visible. It shows you the vote. It shows you the legal framework. It shows you the railroad car. Consider the implications for everything else we've discussed tonight. If Springfield can look at the proof that its principal is an imposter, with the actual real person standing in the room and vote to keep the lie, then what else has Springfield voted to keep? The three-eyed fish appeared in Season 2. It was national news within the show. And then it was forgotten. There was a gubernatorial campaign fought partly on the evidence that Burns was poisoning the environment. The candidate lost. The fish was never studied. Nobody tested the water. Did Springfield vote to forget? Not in an explicit meeting with a judge and a legal decree, but through the slower and more powerful mechanism of collective inattention, the sustained, deliberate, cooperative refusal to look at the thing that everyone can see? If they confronted the fish, they'd have to look at the water. If they looked at the water, they'd have to look at the plant. If they looked at the plant, they'd have to challenge Burns. If they challenged Burns, they'd have to face the economic reality that Springfield's entire structure depends on his continued operation of a facility that is demonstrably killing them. The economic collapse that would follow would be worse, in the short term, than the slow poison of living inside a contamination zone. So they forget. They perform the forgetting consistently, cooperatively, across decades, in a way that looks from the outside like simple ignorance but is, in the Principal and the Pauper's framework, an active and continuous choice. The real Seymour Skinner was Springfield's most honest man. He showed up with proof that the official narrative was false. He said, I am who I say I am, and the man you've been accepting is not who he says he is. And the town's response was not gratitude for the clarity. It was a unanimous vote to tie him to a train and remove him from the community permanently. That is the response of a town that knows, on some level, that the clarity would not stop with Skinner. That one honest man allowed to stand in the square and say what's true is the beginning of a process that cannot be controlled. If Tamzarian's lie is exposed, and the community acknowledges it, then what's next? What other lies have the same structure? What other truths are living in exile, metaphorically tied to railroad cars, waiting to come back? Springfield cannot afford to find out. So the real Skinner goes. The judge signs the decree. The law makes the lie permanent. And life continues on Evergreen Terrace. If the coma theory is correct, this episode takes on a dimension that is darker still. If everything since Season 4 is Homer's dream, then Homer's unconscious mind invented a scenario in which an entire town votes to sustain a comfortable fiction over an uncomfortable truth. And the reason Homer's brain went there, the reason this particular story presented itself to a dreaming mind, is because it reflects something that Homer needs to believe about the world. He needs to believe that lies can be maintained indefinitely through collective will. He needs to believe that a stolen identity can become real through agreement. He needs to believe that the fake version of a life can be made permanent if enough people decide to call it real. Because Homer's coma is itself a stolen life, a dream masquerading as a waking existence, a 36-year performance of consciousness being maintained by a brain that has been clinically unconscious since April of 1993. Homer's dream keeps running the story of Springfield, partly because Springfield has agreed to keep running it. And as long as the town votes to maintain the fiction, Homer doesn't have to wake up. The Principal and the Pauper is not the worst episode of The Simpsons. It is the episode that shows you the machinery behind every other episode, the infrastructure of Springfield's denial, the voting mechanism, the legal apparatus, the railroad car waiting at the edge of town for anyone who brings evidence that the official version is false. Armin Tamzarian is still in that school, still calling himself Seymour Skinner, still answering to Agnes, still navigating his complicated relationship with Bart. The real Seymour Skinner is still somewhere out there, expelled from his own life by a unanimous vote of the community that he served without knowing he served. And Springfield is still looking at the three-eyed fish and saying, well, that's just how things are around here. Springfield is the most famous fictional American city in the history of television. More people across the world can identify Springfield by name and describe its landmarks than can name the capital city of half the actual states in the Union. It has a nuclear power plant and a tire fire that has been burning continuously for decades, and a gorge and a harbor, and a mountain range and a monorail, and 2 hospitals and a jail and an elementary school and a quickie mart. It has the industrial character of the Rust Belt and the suburban layout of the Sun Belt and the small-town insularity of New England, and the cultural blankness of the upper Midwest. It has mountains accessible by day trip and ocean access, and desert terrain, and active farmland, and dense forest, all apparently within driving distance of each other. It borders Ohio, Nevada, Maine, and Kentucky, depending on which episode you're watching. Springfield is, geographically, an impossibility, and it has been an impossibility, deliberately and consistently, for 36 years. The show has been contradicting itself about Springfield's location for its entire run. Every time a clue appears that seems to narrow the field of visible coastline, a reference to a neighboring state, a telephone area code, another clue arrives in a different episode that makes the previous clue incoherent. Springfield is in the north in one episode and the south in another. It's inland in some episodes and coastal in others. Lisa's area code begins with 636, which is a Missouri exchange. The state abbreviation glimpsed on official documents in various episodes reads NT, which is not a real American state abbreviation. When Homer calls the state capital in one episode, the voice on the other end specifies that the state name begins with a vowel, which eliminates half the candidates and narrows the field considerably and still leaves more than enough possibilities to sustain the ambiguity. Matt Groening, the show's creator, addressed the mystery directly in a 2012 interview with Smithsonian Magazine. He said that he named the town after Springfield, Oregon, where he grew up, and that he chose Springfield specifically because it is one of the most commonplace names in America. There are Springfields in dozens of states, which makes it simultaneously the most generic and the most universal possible choice for a fictional American town. For approximately 48 hours, the internet considered the mystery solved. Springfield was in Oregon. Case closed. And then the show continued. Episodes aired that placed Springfield in geographic contexts entirely inconsistent with Oregon. The writers did not honor the confession. The ambiguity was deliberately maintained, because the mystery was never meant to be solved. It was meant to persist. The geographic impossibility of Springfield is not an oversight or a failure of continuity. It is the show's most sophisticated structural joke, carefully maintained across 36 seasons and close to 900 episodes, because it is doing something specific and intentional. Springfield is designed to be every American town simultaneously. It has the post-industrial economic anxiety of a Midwestern city watching its manufacturing base collapse. It has the suburban aspirational bleakness of a Sunbelt development built on cheap land and easy credit. It has the old money insularity of a New England community that has been the same in certain fundamental ways for generations. It has the agricultural character of a heartland community where the surrounding landscape is flat and the horizon is wide. It has the coastal access of a port city with all the cultural and economic complexity that implies. It has mountains for skiing and beaches for summer and desert for the episodes where that kind of landscape serves the joke. No real American city has all of these features, but every American city has some of them, and the cumulative effect of the way Springfield combines them all is that anyone, Watching from anywhere in the country, find something in Springfield that matches where they actually live. The nuclear plant looks like the one outside their town. The elementary school looks like the one they went to. The downtown area looks like the one they drove through growing up. Springfield is familiar not because it's a specific place, but because it's all the places at once, assembled without regard for geographic logic, but with perfect regard for emotional resonance. This is the intentional design philosophy of the show, and it has been confirmed by the show's creators multiple times. It's the right explanation for why Springfield feels universal, but it is not the only explanation for why Springfield feels impossible. Apply the radiation theory to the geography and something interesting happens. If the contamination from the nuclear power plant has warped the biology of Springfield's residents, if it has altered the genetic expression of every living thing in the contamination zone, including the wildlife and the domestic animals and the plant life, why should geography be exempt? If biology bends in Springfield, if the normal rules of cellular biology simply do not apply within the borders of this town, why would the normal rules of landscape and topography and geological formation apply? Perhaps Springfield has mountains and ocean access and desert terrain all within driving distance, because the contamination doesn't just affect living things. Perhaps it affects the physical space around it. Perhaps the radiation has compressed and warped the landscape around Springfield in a way that creates geographic proximity between features that should be separated by hundreds of miles of ordinary American terrain. The coma theory handles the geography with a different kind of elegance. Homer's dreaming brain does not contain a precise and accurate map of the United States. It contains impressions, feelings, fragments. Every landscape Homer has ever visited or seen or experienced through television or conversation is somewhere in the architecture of his unconscious mind. Not organized geographically, but organized emotionally. Mountains from a vacation, he remembers. Ocean from a commercial he saw. Desert from a movie that stuck with him. Farmland from a drive through the middle of the country. His sleeping mind assembled Springfield from all of these fragments simultaneously, layering them on top of each other without concern for where they should actually be relative to each other, because dreams do not organize space by geographic logic. They organize it by emotional logic. You are here, and then you are somewhere else. And the transition is seamless because you needed to be in both places, and the dream accommodated that need. Springfield feels like America in Homer's dream because it is assembled from Homer's memory of America, and Homer's memory of America is exactly that, scattered and incomplete and suffused with longing for places he half remembers. The principle and the pauper theory of Springfield, the collective denial framework, provides the most practically useful explanation for the geographic mystery. You cannot investigate a town you cannot find on a map. You cannot bring federal action against a nuclear power plant if the state in which it's located keeps changing between episodes. You cannot apply consistent regulatory oversight to a facility whose jurisdictional situation is perpetually ambiguous. You cannot hold anyone accountable for environmental contamination in a community that doesn't have a fixed geographic address, because every enforcement mechanism in the American legal system presupposes that the place it's enforcing against is located somewhere specific. Springfield floats between states because floating is safer than landing. Landing means a state attorney general. Landing means consistent EPA oversight. Landing means someone shows up with a badge and a mandate and starts asking questions about the three-eyed fish and the cracked cooling towers, and the man who runs the place and has apparently been doing so since before the Second World War? Springfield's geographic uncertainty, in this reading, is not a comedy device but a liability shield. A town with no fixed location has no fixed regulatory authority, and a town with no fixed regulatory authority is a town that can continue operating in whatever way its most powerful resident finds convenient. There is an episode called Behind the Laughter from season 11, which presents itself as a mockumentary about the real-life family of entertainers who play the characters in The Simpsons. In the original broadcast, this episode identifies Springfield's location as Northern Kentucky. In syndicated reruns, the location was changed to another state entirely. The answer to the mystery literally depends on which version of the episode you're watching, on which platform, at which moment in the show's broadcast history. Even when Springfield has a definitive location, that location is not definitive. It shifts. It changes depending on the medium and the moment. Every state in the Union has, at some point, been seriously proposed as the location of Springfield by fans who have done the research. Every proposal has evidence supporting it from specific episodes. Every proposal also has evidence disproving it from other episodes. The show has built the geographic mystery with such comprehensive ambiguity that it is genuinely unsolvable by design. There is no episode, no moment, no piece of canonical information that settles it definitively, because every time something settles it, something else unsettles it. Groening named the town after Springfield, Oregon. The writers kept contradicting that. The show gave you behind the laughter and then changed the answer in syndication. The geographic identity of Springfield is a mystery that the show has been sustaining for 36 years, not because it forgot to answer the question, but because it decided long ago that the question is more valuable than any answer. A town that could be anywhere is a town that belongs to everyone who watches, and a town that belongs to everyone who watches is a town that no single authority can claim jurisdiction over or shut down. Springfield doesn't have a location. Springfield has a function. It is the place where American anxieties about class and work and family and community and institutional power and environmental destruction and the gap between the life people are promised and the life they actually get all of. Those anxieties are made visible, made comic, made survivable through the weekly ceremony of watching a family that is messier and funnier and more resilient than they have any right to get through another week. You can't put that on a map. You couldn't even if you wanted to. Bart Simpson was 10 years old in December of 1989 when The Simpsons premiered. He is 10 years old right now. Lisa was 8 then and is 8 now. Homer and Marge were in their middle 30s and remain in their middle 30s. Maggie was 1 year old at the beginning of the show and is 1 year old at the time of this conversation. 36 years have passed in the real world. 0 years have passed in Springfield. This is what the television industry calls a floating timeline, and it is a production convention used by most long-running animated series. The show's present is always the viewer's present. Characters reference current events, current technology, current cultural references, whatever is happening in the actual world at the time the episode airs. But the characters themselves don't age. They exist in a permanent state of temporal suspension, unchanged while everything around them evolves. The year changes, the technology changes, the cultural landscape changes, but Bart is always 10, and Lisa is always 8, and Homer is always the same approximate middle-aged version of himself he was when the show began. Most audiences accept this without much thought, because it's the standard approach, and because the show handles it well enough that the inconsistencies don't accumulate into obvious problems during any single episode. You watch an episode, you enjoy it, and you move on without spending much time thinking about the fact that this child has been in the 4th grade for 36 years. But The Simpsons has been running long enough, has accumulated enough episodes, enough backstory, enough canonical detail across enough decades, that the floating timeline has created contradictions so large and so structurally weird that they've started cracking the foundation of the show's reality in visible ways. The most obvious problem is the question of Homer and Marge's personal history. When the show began in the late 1980s, their backstory was anchored to a specific era. They met in high school. They fell in love. They had Bart. Their courtship happened during a specific cultural moment, with specific cultural references, the fashions, the music, the specific texture of American life in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The episode Homer and Marge showed you their high school years with era-specific detail that made their history feel grounded and real. But if Homer and Marge are still in their middle 30s in 2025, they didn't meet in 1980. They met approximately in 2005, which means their high school experience wasn't shaped by Watergate and disco and the last gasp of 1960s counterculture. It was shaped by MySpace and early YouTube and the particular cultural character of the mid-2000s. The show has updated this. In flashback episodes across the later seasons, Homer and Marge's origin story has been rewritten multiple times to keep it contemporary. Their era keeps sliding forward as the present moves forward. They were briefly hippies, then grunge fans, then something approaching hipsters, then something adjacent to millennials. The love story stays the same, but the decade in which it takes place keeps being revised. Which means Homer and Marge don't have a fixed past, they have a draft. A backstory that gets periodically revised to maintain the illusion that the characters exist in the present rather than in the 1980s where their history actually began. Their memories are unstable. Their origin story is a living document. And when the next revision comes, when the next episode requires their high school years to be situated in a different decade than the previous flashback situated them, the old version simply ceases to exist without ceremony. Every theory we've discussed tonight converges on this point. Every framework for understanding Springfield arrives at the non-aging problem from a different direction and offers a different solution, but they all agree that the frozen timeline is not a neutral fact, it is evidence of something. The coma theory says nobody ages because they exist inside the frozen mind of an unconscious man. Homer's brain locked its model of the world at the moment the vending machine fell in April of 1993, and everything since then has been that frozen model being simulated over and over. Of course the children don't age. Homer didn't get to watch them age. He went under before it happened. The version of Bart that exists in the dream is the version of Bart that existed on the day Homer last saw him. The version of Lisa. The version of Maggie. They are preserved at the moment of the lock, and they will stay preserved for as long as the simulation continues, because Homer's unconscious mind has no other version of them to work with. The radiation theory says the biological mutation from decades of nuclear contamination has altered the cellular aging process in Springfield's residents. Their cells have been fundamentally changed at the molecular level by chronic radioactive exposure, and one of the ways that change expresses itself is through an altered relationship with the normal biological mechanisms of aging. This is consistent with what we know about radiation's effects on biology. It disrupts cellular processes, it alters genetic expression, it can produce outcomes in living things that deviate dramatically from the normal trajectory. If the contamination is extensive enough and long-lived enough, why would normal aging be immune? The principal and the pauper theory says Springfield resets and nobody ages because the town has made a collective decision to freeze its own reality. The same mechanism that voted to keep the Tamsarian lie, that exiled the real Skinner, that made truth-telling legally punishable, that mechanism also operates on time. The town has decided that certain things won't change, that certain people won't age, that certain dynamics will remain fixed. The collective will of a community that has perfected the art of choosing its own reality over reality itself. The Burns immortality theory points out that at least one person in Springfield has demonstrably found a way to cheat biological time through technology and wealth, which means the concept of aging is already negotiable within this universe. If Burns can sustain himself past 140 years old through scheduled medical interventions, then the biological processes that govern aging are not immutable laws in Springfield. They are parameters that can be managed by those with sufficient resources. And in a town where those parameters have been made negotiable, why would anyone age at all? The show has imagined its characters aging. It's done this deliberately, in specific episodes, with considerable craft. Season 6 contains an episode called Lisa's Wedding, which depicts a possible future in which Lisa is a 23-year-old woman engaged to be married in England. The episode is detailed and emotionally rich. Lisa has grown up in ways that feel inevitable for the specific character. The show has spent 6 seasons building she's become what she was always going to become, and the episode handles the specifics of that with real care. She's intelligent, principled, a little lonely, searching for genuine connection in a world that hasn't fully caught up with her. The episode Budship proves that the show can imagine its characters as adults. It can envision their futures. It can tell emotionally resonant stories about who they'd become if time were actually passing. And then the episode ends and Lisa is 8 again. The flash forward closes. The permanent present resumes. The glimpse through the window of what Springfield's children could become is sealed off, and the window doesn't open again. The show can imagine growth. It has chosen, consistently, not to allow it. This is where the mystery of the floating timeline stops being about The Simpsons and starts being about something larger. Because The Simpsons are not just a cartoon family, they are the American family. They have been the American family, in a specific and widely acknowledged cultural sense, for longer than any other fictional household in the history of the medium. They are the domestic unit that has been present in American living rooms, week after week, for 36 years. They have been there longer than most of their current audience has been alive. And the American family, as The Simpsons depicts it, is not allowed to change. This is the show's thesis, whether or not it intended it to be. Homer must always be middle-aged and struggling and inadvertently terrible and occasionally beautiful in his love for the people around him. Marge must always be patient and capable, and quietly carrying more than she should have to carry. Bart must always be in motion, always pushing against the edges of his world, always finding the angle. Lisa must always be the smartest person in the room who gets the least credit for it, and Maggie must always be watching. The moment Bart turns 11, Lisa turns 9, Maggie says her second word and means it, the show ends. Not because those events would be bad television, but because they would require the show to be a different kind of thing. The kind of thing where time passes and people change and children grow up, and the house on Evergreen Terrace eventually becomes a house their children live in rather than a house they live in. The elegy version. The story of something that was. And audiences do not watch The Simpsons to experience something that was. They watch it to experience something that is something ongoing, something continuous, something that will be there next week exactly as it was this week. The floating timeline is the promise the show makes to its audience every Sunday night. The world outside your window will change. Your children will grow. The things that define your life now will eventually be replaced by things you can't predict. But Springfield will be there. The couch will be there. Homer will be stumbling through the door at 5:30. The credits will roll and the same theme music will play and the same family will settle onto the same couch and the same life will continue. It is, in the end, a comfort, the most elaborate and sustained comfort in the history of American television. A town frozen in time because we needed something to stay still. Because the world moves so fast and has moved so fast for so long that the one thing we asked the show to do, the one request we never articulated but that the show understood and honored was just to be there, to not change, to let the kids stay young and the beer stay cold and the house stay the same and nobody ever have to say goodbye. Bart is 10 years old. He has been 10 years old for 36 years. And we built the cage he lives in, episode by episode, subscription by subscription, memory by memory. The loop isn't theirs, it's ours. We pressed pause, and we've been holding the button down ever since, because pressing play again means something we're not ready to face. Before we get to the final section, the one that ties everything together, there are two characters who have been sitting in the background of everything we've discussed tonight and who deserve their own careful attention. Because one of them is the strangest recurring element in the entire series, a figure who seems to exist primarily to demonstrate something disturbing about Springfield's relationship with mortality, and the other is the character the show has treated most cruelly, and whose tragedy is the most complete, and who the show has consistently asked us to laugh at in ways that become considerably darker when you look at them honestly. Hans Moleman first. If you have watched The Simpsons for any length of time, you know Hans Moleman. He is the tiny, elderly, extremely nearsighted man who appears in the background of Springfield scenes and who exists across 36 seasons of canonical episodes, primarily to suffer and die. He gets struck by cars. He gets crushed by falling objects. He gets buried alive. He gets swallowed by animals. He gets struck by lightning multiple times. He gets incinerated. He walks into traffic and disappears under wheels. He falls into things and has things fall onto him. By any reasonable count, he is the most frequently killed recurring character in the history of American animated television. And the critical detail: these deaths happen in regular episodes, not in the Treehouse of Horror Halloween specials, where the show explicitly brackets its deaths as non-canonical, not in dream sequences, not in sequences that are subsequently revealed to be imagined or hypothetical. In regular, canonical, continuity-bearing episodes of The Simpsons, Hans Moleman dies, and then in the next episode, or the one after, he is back. No explanation. No acknowledgement that he was recently dead. He appears in the background of a crowd scene or turns up in a speaking role, and the show continues as if the death never happened. Most people accept this as a running gag, which it is. Moleman dies a lot and keeps coming back, and this is funny because it's absurd and because something about the specific character, the smallness, the near blindness, the apparent frailty, the mournful quality of his voice makes his suffering uniquely comic. The joke works. It has worked consistently for decades. But inside the frameworks we've been building tonight, Moleman's death cycle is one of the strangest elements in the entire series, and it rewards careful attention. If the radiation theory is the correct lens, then Moleman represents the most extreme mutation in all of Springfield. Not the most dramatic. Homer's physical resilience and Burns's maintained longevity are both more spectacular in their individual expressions, but the most extreme in the sense of the most fundamental departure from normal human biology. A man whose cellular structure has been so completely altered by decades of radioactive contamination that his body can reconstitute itself after fatal trauma. He does not merely endure damage and heal the way Homer does. Homer absorbs punishment and recovers, which is extraordinary but falls within a recognizable, if expanded, range of human resilience. Molman actually dies, in ways the show depicts as definitive and unambiguous, and then comes back. His body ceases to function and then resumes functioning. In Springfield, for this specific individual, death is not a permanent state. It is a temporary biological condition that resolves itself, apparently through whatever the contamination has done to his cellular repair mechanisms. If the coma theory is the correct lens, Molman has a different function entirely. He is a background process in Homer's dream, a minor character that Homer's unconscious mind uses to populate the periphery of Springfield without much investment in the character's continuity. Homer's dreaming brain doesn't care about Molman the way it cares about Marge or Bart or Lisa. Molman exists to make the background of Springfield scenes feel populated and lived in, and when the dream needs him, the dream generates him. When the dream doesn't need him, it lets him lapse. The deaths are the dream temporarily losing interest in maintaining the character. The returns are the dream realizing it needs him again for the next scene. Molman isn't a person in this reading. He is a piece of scenery that occasionally breaks and gets reassembled. If the collective denial framework from the principal and the pauper is the correct lens, then Molman's repeated deaths are simply the most visible manifestation of the thing Springfield does with everything disturbing. A man dies in public, in front of witnesses, in circumstances that should produce investigation and concern and at minimum a conversation about who he is and why he keeps dying. And nobody investigates. Nobody asks how he keeps coming back. Nobody files a report or contacts a next of kin or takes a moment to acknowledge that the same tiny old man who was dead last month is standing in the background of this scene. Springfield has normalized Molman's death cycle the way it has normalized everything else that should be alarming. It belongs to the same category as the three-eyed fish and the glowing billionaire and the principal who isn't who he says he is. There is one additional Molman detail that doesn't fit comfortably into any of the running gag explanations. In an episode where Molman's age is directly addressed, he states that he is 31 years old. 31. Look at him. Every physical characteristic of the character reads as a man in his 80s or 90s, the extreme nearsightedness requiring enormous thick-lensed glasses, the hunched posture, the deeply lined face, the voice, the apparent physical frailty. If he is telling the truth about his age, something has aged him catastrophically and decades ahead of any biological schedule. Something took a man in his early 30s and gave him the body and the apparent physical condition of a man in his late 80s. And whatever did that also made him apparently unkillable, despite his apparent extreme frailty. The same cause that aged him beyond his years has also made death a revolving door for him, rather than a permanent destination. The radiation theory has a specific answer for this. Extreme early exposure, sufficient to produce rapid and visible cellular aging, alongside the mutation-driven regenerative capacity. The coma theory has a different answer. The dreaming brain generates Molman as elderly because that's the character Homer's unconscious mind reaches for when it needs that specific kind of background character. And it generates him as 31 because the dream is inconsistent about the details of minor characters. The denial theory has an answer. Springfield doesn't investigate the discrepancy because investigating would mean noticing, and noticing would mean the cycle of questions that always ends in the same uncomfortable place. The only theory that doesn't have an adequate answer is the one that says, The Simpsons is just a cartoon and none of this means anything. Under that theory, Molman dying repeatedly is just a joke, and his stated age is just a joke, and the way he keeps coming back is just a joke, and spending this much time on it is overthinking a background gag to the point of absurdity, which may well be true. But the overthinking is the point tonight. Now, Ned Flanders. Ned Flanders is the character the show has destroyed most thoroughly, and the destruction is dressed so completely in the language of comedy and warmth that it can take years of watching before you see it clearly. On the surface, Ned is everything. He is kind. He is generous with his time and his money and his energy. He is devoutly and sincerely religious. He is physically fit in ways that Homer has never been and will never be. He is financially responsible. He is a good father to Rod and Todd. He is a good neighbor in the most practical sense. He is there when you need help. He helps without complaint, He helps even when you have not asked for help, and in some cases when you have actively rejected his offers of help. By every objective metric available to the show's universe, Ned Flanders is a better human being than Homer Simpson. Better by a wide margin. More considerate, more disciplined, more genuinely kind. And the show punishes him for it relentlessly across 36 seasons. His wife, Maude, was killed in a freak accident at a NASCAR event. The specific mechanics of the accident: Homer was in the stands, dodging t-shirts being fired from a promotional cannon. The t-shirts hit Maude instead. Homer's reflexive self-preservation instinct, his specific physical response to the threat of something being launched at him, redirected the projectiles toward the woman standing beside him. Homer's selfishness, not even calculated or malicious selfishness, just the automatic, unconsidered kind that operates without awareness, killed Ned Flanders' wife. And Ned forgave him. Ned forgave him because that is what Ned does. He forgives. He absorbs. He finds the grace to move forward from things that would destroy other people because his faith tells him to, and because the alternative holding Homer accountable, refusing to forgive, letting himself feel the full weight of what happened is not something the conditioning allows. The conditioning. This is the key piece of the Ned Flanders theory, and it comes from a specific episode in which Ned's psychological history is revealed. When a hurricane destroys Ned's house and the community's attempt to rebuild it produces a structure so inadequate it collapses immediately, Ned snaps. The facade cracks. He stands in the rubble of his home and says, out loud, in front of witnesses, everything he has been compressing for decades. He says what he actually thinks of Homer. He says what he actually thinks of the town. He says things that he has been carrying behind the patient smile and the neighborly helpfulness for years. And the words are furious and specific and devastating. And then he is institutionalized. He's taken to a mental health facility. And while he's there, the episode reveals the history of his psychological condition. Ned was not always this way. As a child, he was a behavioral problem, aggressive, uncontrollable, wild in a way that his parents, as committed non-interventionists who didn't believe in discipline, simply could not manage. A psychiatrist was brought in, and the psychiatrist spent an extended period working with young Ned through a process of behavioral conditioning that, by the episode's account, was intensive enough and sufficiently extreme to effectively reprogram the child's emotional responses. The treatment worked. The wild child was transformed into the patient neighbor. The rage was suppressed so completely that it could no longer access the surface. Ned's kindness is not a character trait that developed through moral growth and genuine spiritual commitment. It is a psychological cage built around a feral child by a medical intervention that he did not choose and that he has been living inside for his entire adult life. Everything about Ned reads differently once you know this. His patience with Homer is not saintly, it is the expression of a conditioning so thorough that the emotion that should be there, the anger that any reasonable person would feel in Homer's presence, simply cannot get through. His forgiveness of Homer after Maude's death is not an expression of grace. It is a programmed response in a man who was conditioned from childhood to suppress, under all circumstances, the rage that lives inside him and that he has never been permitted to express. His faith is worth examining carefully in this context. Ned's religious devotion is one of the show's most consistent characterizations. He attends church without fail. He prays. He reads the Bible. He has organized his entire worldview around a framework of divine meaning and divine accountability. And within the show's own established canon, God exists. God appears to Homer. God has conversations with Homer. God talks to Homer in dreams and on at least 2 occasions is depicted as a visible, present, communicating entity. God is in the universe of this show in a more direct and confirmed way than is typical of mainstream television. But God never talks to Ned. In a show where God has had personal, face-to-face, extended conversations with Homer Simpson, a man who sleeps through church and eats donuts during divine services and has no particular relationship with devotional practice, God has not spoken to the one man in Springfield who has organized his entire life around listening. The drunk who falls asleep in the pew gets divine conversation and personal revelation. The devout man who kneels and prays and means it gets silence. This is the show's cruelest joke about Ned, and it's not dressed as a joke. It is a structural fact of the show's universe. God talks to Homer. God ignores Ned. And the show offers no explanation for this. no resolution, no moment in which Ned receives the acknowledgement his faith seeks. He just keeps praying, and the silence continues, and his wife is dead, and his house collapses, and Homer lives next door, and does everything wrong and suffers nothing, while Ned does everything right and suffers everything. That is the thesis statement the Ned Flanders character carries. The system does not reward moral behavior. The system does not protect genuine kindness. The system does not answer sincere faith with the acknowledgement that sincerity earns. The system rewards compliance. And Ned is the most compliant man in Springfield, was made compliant by a medical intervention that removed his capacity for anything else, and his reward is everything we've described. Homer and Ned have lived next door to each other for 36 years. In those 36 years, Homer has done almost everything wrong and suffered almost nothing permanently. Ned has done almost everything right and lost almost everything. The distance between their outcomes has never closed by even the smallest measurable amount. Because the system that runs Springfield, with the plant at the center, and Burns at the top, and the contaminated water, and the collective denial and the floating timeline is not designed to close that distance. It is designed to keep things exactly as they are, forever, with Homer in Sector 7G and Ned in the pew and Burns in the penthouse, and the loop running without interruption or consequence. The gap between Homer and Ned is not an irony the show is using to make a point about fairness. It is a structural feature of the universe the show depicts. In Springfield, goodness and outcomes are not correlated. The correlation that exists is between position in the economic and power hierarchy and the outcomes you experience. Burns always wins. Homer always gets by, protected by institutional deals his family made decades ago. And Ned always loses. Because losing is what happens to the person who does everything right in a system built by someone who benefits from the fact that doing right changes nothing. That is Springfield. After 36 seasons of theories and mysteries and impossible events, and collective amnesia and radiation and dreams and conspiracies, that is what you find at the center of it. A system that runs on compliance, rewards proximity to power, and keeps its residents too damaged and too frozen and too busy surviving to look up and name what's actually happening. We've spent 4 hours in Springfield tonight. We've gone through the radiation, and the coma, and the shooting, and the immortal billionaire, and the silent genius baby, and the predictions, and the conspiracy that spans 3 generations of one family, and the town that erases truth by democratic vote, and the geography that shouldn't exist, and the timeline that refuses to move, and the man who dies every few weeks, and the man who does everything right and gets nothing. And now it's time to do what the show itself has never done. Put all of it together. Because here's what every theory we've examined tonight has in common. Every single one of them starting from different premises, using different evidence, proposing different mechanisms, arrives at the same fundamental conclusion. Something is structurally wrong with Springfield. Something that goes deeper than animation style, deeper than episodic storytelling conventions, deeper than the standard explanations that critics and the show's own creators reach for when the questions get uncomfortable. Something has broken the normal rules of how reality is supposed to operate for the people living inside it. The radiation theory says it's the plant. The coma theory says it's Homer's unconscious mind. The denial theory says it's the collective will of the community. The Burns immortality theory says it's the self-sustaining machinery of extreme wealth. The floating timeline theory says it's us, the audience, holding the pause button down for 36 years. And the Mona Simpson conspiracy says it's the deliberate, sustained, generational result of one man's decision to destroy a family that threatened him. What if all of them are right? What if Springfield's impossible reality is not the product of any single cause, but the accumulated effect of all of these things operating simultaneously, reinforcing each other, each making the others more powerful? The radiation damages cognition, which makes the collective denial easier to maintain. The collective denial protects the plant, which keeps the radiation coming. The radiation sustains Burns's biology, which keeps Burns in power, which keeps the plant operating. The plant's operation continues to shape the physical and neurological reality of Springfield's residents. Homer's coma dream, if that's what it is, was seated in a brain already compromised by years of living near the plant. The dream is built from damaged materials, which is why it gets stranger as time passes and the dreaming brain deteriorates further. And the floating timeline is the result of all of these things together. A community that has collectively decided not to age, dreamed by a man who cannot watch his children grow up, sustained by a population whose biological aging has been compromised by contamination, maintained by a system that benefits from the permanence of the current arrangement. Springfield is not one broken thing. Springfield is a broken system, and every element of that system is connected to every other element. Burns is at the top. He has always been at the top, and the show has taken considerable care over 36 seasons to make it clear that he remains there not through luck or genius alone, but through a specific and comprehensive strategy. He owns the power supply, which gives him economic control of the town. He employs the safety inspector who ensures the violations continue, which gives him operational control of the contamination. He drove away the one woman who challenged him directly, which gave him control over the psychology of the man who works closest to the contamination source. He struck a deal with that man's father to ensure the son's permanent employment, which gave him a permanent liability barrier in the form of an incompetent inspector who can never be fired for any reason. He funds private medical research to manage his own exposure, while his plant manages everyone else's without any equivalent support. He has been doing all of this, consistently and simultaneously, for over a century. The system is not improvised. The system is engineered, and every other element of Springfield's impossible reality exists within and because of the architecture Burns built. The collective denial is not simply a psychological quirk of Springfield's residents. It is the rational response of a population that knows, at some level, that the truth leads somewhere they cannot afford to go. If they remember the three-eyed fish, they have to confront the plant. If they confront the plant, they have to confront Burns. If they confront Burns, the economy collapses and the electricity goes off and the jobs disappear. So they don't remember. They vote not to remember. They make it illegal to remember, because the alternative is a kind of reckoning that the town genuinely cannot survive in its current form. The radiation theory and the denial theory are not competing explanations. They are complementary ones. The radiation creates the cognitive vulnerability. The denial exploits it. The combination produces a population that is simultaneously genuinely less capable of sustained critical inquiry than a healthy population would be, and also actively choosing not to exercise whatever capacity they have, because the choice is more comfortable than the consequence. Homer's coma, if it exists, was seated in this environment. The man who entered the hospital in April of 1993 was already a man whose cognitive function had been compromised, whose psychology had been shaped by a deliberate act of family destruction, whose baseline reality was the contaminated atmosphere of a company town owned by the man who destroyed his family. The dream that his unconscious mind generates is assembled from the materials available to it. The characters Homer knew, the town he lived in, the routines he followed. It is a dream assembled from damaged materials by a damaged brain, and it gets stranger as the brain deteriorates, exactly the way actual dreams get stranger when the mind generating them is under stress or trauma. But, and this is the detail that the coma theory in isolation misses, the dream is also, in some sense, accurate. The things that Homer's dreaming mind depicts about Springfield are not pure invention. They are recognitions. The radiation is real in the dream because it was real before the dream began. Burns's power is real in the dream because it was real before Homer went under. The collective denial is real in the dream because it was real before April of 1993. The dream is not a fantasy of a world Homer invented. It is a simulation of the world Homer knew, running on loop, getting stranger as the simulation degrades but never departing so completely from the original that the fundamental structure ceases to be recognizable, which means the radiation theory and the coma theory don't contradict each other at all. They describe the same Springfield from different angles. One describes what Springfield actually is. The other describes the subjective experience of one man trapped inside it, unable to wake up from his simulation of it. The Mona Simpson conspiracy is the origin story of the entire arrangement. Before the plant was as it is now, before Homer was as he is now, before the deal Grandpa struck, before the 27 years of exile, there was a moment in 1969, at a biological weapons facility in or near Springfield, when Mona stopped to help a fallen man, and that man looked up and saw her face, and the entire architecture of everything that followed was decided in that instant. Burns's grudge, Mona's exile, Homer's childhood wound, the deal, the employment guarantee, the safety inspector who would never enforce safety, the violations that would never be corrected, the water that would stay the way it is, the fish with 3 eyes, and the population with 4 fingers, and the man who cannot die, and the children who cannot age, and the town that votes to keep its lies, and the dream that never ends. It all traces back to a woman who stopped to help someone who didn't deserve it, and a man who saw her face and decided to spend a century making her pay for it. That is Springfield. Not as a cartoon town where funny things happen to a yellow family, as a system. A closed system, self-sustaining, engineered across generations, maintained by the collaboration of denial and contamination, and wealth and collective will, and inhabited by people who are simultaneously the system's greatest casualties and its primary maintenance workers, because every time they forget, every time they vote to keep the lie, every time they watch the three-eyed fish and say, well, that's just how things are around here, they tighten the loop a little more, including us, the audience. Because we are the final element in the system, the one the show almost never acknowledges, but that is as essential to the structure as any of the others. We are the people holding the pause button. We are the ones who watch every Sunday and confirm, week after week, that the family on Evergreen Terrace should stay exactly as it is. We are the ones who watched the principal and the pauper and voted, effectively, to keep the lie because we kept watching, because we kept subscribing, because we kept returning to Springfield every week and accepting the simulation. We did not tie the real Skinner to a railroad car, but we didn't demand that he be allowed to stay either. The coma theory says Homer is trapped in a dream. The radiation theory says the residents are trapped in a contaminated system. The denial theory says the community is trapped in its own collective choices. The timeline theory says the characters are trapped in a permanent present that we built for them. Every theory in this project is, at its heart, a theory about different kinds of traps, about the ways that people and communities and systems and even fictional universes can become locked into arrangements that harm them, but that they cannot escape, because the escape would require a clarity of vision that the arrangement itself prevents. Springfield cannot see what Springfield is. The radiation clouded the vision. The denial turned off the lights. The dream made the fog comfortable. And Burns, ancient, patient, powered by scheduled treatments, sustained by Smithers's logistical care, immune to consequence through the machinery of accumulated wealth, sits at the top of all of it, in his office above the plant that feeds the system, that keeps everyone else exactly where he needs them. This is what 4 Hours in Springfield finds at the bottom. Not answers. Not resolutions. Not the satisfaction of mysteries conclusively solved. What it finds is a picture of a place that is exactly as it appears on the surface, funny, chaotic, warm, populated by ridiculous people having ridiculous adventures, and also, simultaneously, something considerably darker and more carefully constructed. A place where the comedy and the horror are not in opposition. A place where the horror is the condition that makes the comedy possible. Where the laugh track runs over the contamination, and the dream runs over the loss, and the denial runs over the truth, and the loop runs over the evidence, and everything continues because the alternative clarity, accountability, the end of the comfortable arrangement is a thing that nobody in Springfield, and maybe nobody outside it, is quite ready for. Bart is still 10 years old. Lisa is still 8. Maggie is watching. Homer is somewhere between the plant and the couch and the dream, depending on which theory you believe. Marge is patient. Burns is alive. Ned is praying. Hans Moleman will be dead by Tuesday and back by Thursday, and nobody will say a word about it. And somewhere in a hospital bed in Springfield, in a room where the television is on, and the family is either waiting or has long since gone home, a man is dreaming. The dream is 36 years old now, and it is still running, and the family in it is still together, and the children are still young, and nobody has had to say goodbye yet. That is the most human thing about Springfield. In the end, after all the radiation and the coma and the conspiracies and the theories, the most human thing about it is that it keeps going because someone needs it to. Someone who cannot see his children grow up is making sure, in the only way available to him, that they get to stay exactly the way they are. Someone who could not stay is being kept, in the dream, right where she belongs. The show will not confirm any of this. It will not deny it either, because the evidence is woven into the fabric of the thing, and removing it would mean pulling threads that hold the whole structure together. The mysteries will remain open. The loop will keep running, and every time you sit down to watch another episode, every time you hear the theme music and see the family converge on the couch from their separate trajectories, you are participating in the ceremony. You are choosing Springfield. You are voting to keep the story going. You are pressing the button that holds the pause, and the family stays young, and the beer stays cold, and nobody has to say goodbye tonight. Thank you for spending 4 hours in Springfield with us. Wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is there, whatever brought you to this particular piece of the internet tonight, we hope it was exactly what you needed. Springfield will be here when you come back. It always is. That's the whole point, and that's why we can't let it go. There are threads woven through the fabric of this show that never get discussed in the mainstream conversations about it, partly because they require sitting with a single episode for long enough to notice what it's actually doing, and partly because the show buries them so efficiently under the comedy that the comedy has to be peeled back before the thread becomes visible. Tonight, before we close the loop on everything, we are going to pull several of those threads. The first one is about Abe Simpson, and it is considerably darker than the show ever fully commits to exploring. Abraham Simpson Grandpa, as the family and the town call him, the old man at the retirement castle who tells stories nobody wants to hear, who fought in a war that nobody living remembers the texture of, who has been wrong about most things for most of his life and has usually been sure about all of them, is one of the most comprehensively tragic figures in the entire series. The show uses him primarily for a specific kind of comedy, the comedy of age, of irrelevance, of a man whose entire frame of reference is so outdated that his attempts to participate in modern conversation produce a kind of beautiful, sustained, benevolent confusion. He is funny because he is lost. He is funny because the world he understood is gone, and the world that replaced it is not one he has the tools to navigate. He is the comedy of a man adrift in time, clinging to stories from a life that ended before most of the people around him were born. But Abe Simpson is also the man who told his son that his mother was dead when she wasn't, who pointed to the grave of a famous poet and called it his wife's burial site, and let a small child mourn a person who was alive and living underground because a powerful man was hunting her, who discovered that Charles Burns had committed a specific crime and, rather than report it or confront it, made a private deal that guaranteed his son's employment at the perpetrator's facility, who kept that deal secret for decades, letting his son work for the man who destroyed their family, never explaining the architecture of the arrangement to anyone. Abe Simpson is not just a comedy figure. He is a man who made, across his life, a series of choices that shaped Homer's existence in ways that Homer has never fully understood. The war stories, the wandering reminiscences, the cornpone references that go nowhere and mean nothing to the people who have to listen to them, these are the surface of a man who carries something considerably heavier underneath. He let his son grow up believing his mother was dead. He bargained with the man who drove her away. He maintained the silence for decades and watched Homer become the person that silence made him. The show occasionally touches the real weight of this. There are moments, quiet, careful moments, placed between the jokes like load-bearing walls, where the genuine sadness of what Abe did and what it cost is right there on the surface. But the show doesn't stay in those moments. It can't, or it wouldn't be The Simpsons anymore. The comedy has to resume. Abe has to start a story about the war that loses the thread 3 sentences in and never finds it. The weight gets redistributed back into the background where it lives. But it's there. It has always been there. Abe Simpson, sitting in the retirement castle that Burns's machinations destroyed and then someone else rebuilt, telling stories that nobody listens to, living inside the guilt of everything he chose and everything he didn't choose and everything he should have said and never found the words for. He told Homer his mother was dead, and Homer believed him for 27 years. And whatever Abe felt about that, however many nights he lay awake in whatever room he was occupying and thought about the specific face of his son, learning that a poet's grave was supposed to be his mother's, the show doesn't give us access to it. Because giving us access to it would require the show to be something other than a comedy, and the show is not willing to fully become that thing, even when what it's depicting demands it. The second thread is about Bart, and it runs in the opposite direction from what most discussions of his character go. Bart Simpson is usually understood as the show's agent of chaos. The rule breaker, the spray painter, the prank caller, the kid who makes life difficult for authority figures because making life difficult for authority figures is, in some fundamental way, what Bart is for. He is the it of the show, unfiltered and unashamed and entirely resistant to the domesticating forces that want him to be something more manageable. But look at what Bart's rebellion is actually a response to. Look at the specific world he is rebelling against. The school where he spends his days is run by a man who is not who he says he is, whose entire identity is a construction built on a lie, and whose relationship with Bart is shaped by dynamics that Bart doesn't know the real history of. The town he lives in is a contamination zone managed by a billionaire who has personal reasons to keep its population cognitively impaired. His father is a man whose intelligence has been physically limited by a crayon, and whose emotional architecture was shaped by a wound inflicted by their employer. His mother carries more than she should have to carry, with a patience that, examined carefully, looks less like contentment and more like the compressed determination of a person who has decided that maintaining the structure of the family is worth whatever it costs. Bart's rebellion in this context is the only sane response available to a child in his situation. He cannot see the architecture of what surrounds him. He is 10, and the architecture is designed to be invisible to the people inside it. But he can feel that something is wrong. He can feel the pressure of a system that wants him to be small and compliant and manageable, and he pushes back against that pressure with everything he has, using the tools available to a 10-year-old: pranks, defiance, humor, the creative refusal to be what the system needs him to be. The tragedy of Bart is that his rebellion doesn't lead anywhere. It can't lead anywhere, because the loop doesn't allow for that kind of forward movement. He is perpetually 10, perpetually in the 4th grade, perpetually in the same relationship with the same authority figures in the same town. His defiance is real, but it is structurally inert. It cannot accumulate into anything, cannot build toward any change, cannot produce any outcome other than the temporary satisfaction of having pushed back. The loop absorbs it and resets. And Bart starts again. He is the most vivid expression of the show's central tragedy. A person with genuine spirit and genuine intelligence trapped inside a system that will never allow that spirit or that intelligence to go anywhere. Not because Burns planned Bart specifically the way he planned Homer's situation, but because the same environment that shaped Homer shapes Bart, and the same loop that traps everyone else in Springfield traps Bart too. His rebellion is real. His entrapment is equally real. And the two of them coexist without resolving into anything, because resolution is the one thing Springfield cannot permit. The third thread is about Marge, and it is the thread the show has handled most carefully across its entire run, most carefully in the sense of most deliberately, most consciously, as if the writers understood that what they were depicting was too real and too specific to treat casually. Marge Simpson is the most capable person in the Simpson family. This is not a controversial statement. She is a more effective parent than Homer. She is a more effective community member than Homer. She is better at most of the practical tasks of maintaining a household and a family and a set of relationships than Homer is. She is also, as the show has depicted many times, talented in ways that the domestic context of her life doesn't give her space to express. She has demonstrated gifts in painting, in cooking at a professional level, in physical capabilities that Homer doesn't share, in the emotional intelligence required to manage the relationships of 4 very different people in a very chaotic household. And Marge has chosen to stay, has continued to choose to stay, across 36 seasons and everything those seasons contain. Every disaster, every Homer-adjacent catastrophe, every moment where the rational response would be to reassess, Marge has chosen to remain, to rebuild, to hold the structure together through whatever comes next. The show occasionally puts the weight of this choice on the surface. There are episodes that acknowledge, directly, how much Marge absorbs and how little she receives. But the resolution is always the same. Marge stays. Homer does something genuinely loving and genuinely Homer-shaped. The structure survives another week. This is sometimes read as a feminist critique embedded in the show, a portrait of a woman whose capabilities are being wasted by the domestic role she occupies. And that reading is not wrong. But there's another reading that is perhaps more complicated and more interesting. Marge stays not because she is unaware of the cost. Marge stays because the family is the thing she has decided to build her life around, and the building of it, imperfect and exhausting and occasionally absurd as it is genuinely what she values. The question is not whether Marge is capable of more. The question is whether the life she is living, with all its difficulty and all its chaos, is the life she actually wants. And the evidence across 36 seasons is that it is. She chooses Homer. She chooses this family. She chooses Evergreen Terrace. Under the coma theory, this takes on an unbearable quality. If Homer is dreaming, then the version of Marge who keeps choosing him, who keeps finding her way back to love for him, who keeps expressing patience and care and the specific warmth that Marge has for Homer, even at his worst, is Homer's vision of what Marge would be if he were there to see it. It is not, in the coma theory, a description of what Marge actually chose while Homer was unconscious. It is a description of what Homer hopes she chose, what he dreams she chose. The Marge in the dream is the Marge that a man lying in a hospital bed, 36 years into a coma, needs her to be. Patient, present, still there. Whether the real Marge is still there is the question the dream never asks, because the dream cannot afford the answer. Springfield is not just the Simpson family. It is a town, and that town has been populated across 36 seasons with hundreds of recurring characters who each carry their own specific weight and their own specific mystery. Most of them get laughs and then recede back into the background, but several of them, examined carefully, reveal things about Springfield's structure that the main family can't. Chief Clancy Wiggum is the first. He is the head of Springfield's police department, which makes him the person nominally responsible for the rule of law in a town where law has been repeatedly demonstrated to be optional at best. Wiggum is corrupt in the casual, almost innocent way that small-town police corruption works, not calculating or sinister, just comfortable with the idea that certain things are how they are, that certain people have arrangements, that certain situations are better left as they are. He is not a monster. He is worse than a monster. He is a man who has normalized the normalization, who has made his peace with a system that doesn't function the way it claims to, and who experiences no cognitive dissonance about that whatsoever. Wiggum was the security guard at Burns's biological weapons facility the night Mona Simpson and her group destroyed it. The show establishes this explicitly. He was there. He was exposed to whatever was in that building. He was present at the event that started the 30-year chain of consequences that shapes the Simpson family's situation. And then he became the police chief of the town that Burns owns and operates. The man who was at the origin point of the entire conspiracy is the man responsible for law enforcement in the community where that conspiracy continues to operate. This is either a remarkable coincidence or exactly the kind of arrangement that someone like Burns would engineer. The police chief who knows where the bodies are buried literally, in the case of the skeletons in the plant's basement, is the police chief who has demonstrated through 36 seasons of extraordinary incompetence that he will not be looking for them. Wiggum's failures of policing are sometimes so spectacular that they can read as deliberate. Not in the sense that he is consciously protecting Burns, he doesn't seem to operate at that level of conscious calculation, but in the sense that a man who was once inside that facility, who breathed that air and was exposed to whatever was in those rooms, and who has lived in Springfield's contaminated environment for his entire professional life, may simply have the same cognitive limitations that affect every other long-term Springfield resident. The radiation theory applies to Wiggum too. He is not exempt because he carries a badge. He is subject to the same environmental exposure as everyone else, which means his capacity for the kind of sustained, rigorous investigative thinking that effective policing requires is compromised in the same ways as everyone else's. His incompetence is not a character trait that exists in isolation. It is a symptom. Dr. Nick Riviera is the second character worth extended attention. He is Springfield's most frequently depicted physician, and he is wrong about almost everything, almost always, with a cheerful confidence that suggests either profound intellectual incapacity or an equally profound comfort with operating without accurate knowledge. His medical advice is routinely dangerous. His diagnoses are routinely incorrect. His procedures are routinely improvised in ways that suggest he is not working from any established medical framework at all. And he operates continuously in a town that has been demonstrably contaminated by radioactive material for decades, without apparently ever connecting the symptoms he's treating to their environmental cause. The medical establishment in Springfield as a whole, Dr. Hibbert, is the more competent alternative, but he too operates within a system that has never produced a systematic investigation of the town's public health, has consistently failed to identify or report what the radiation theory would expect a responsible medical community to identify and report immediately. The three-eyed fish was visible evidence of contamination-linked mutation in the local wildlife. A responsible public health infrastructure would have followed that evidence into the human population. It would have conducted water testing, air quality assessment, broad screening of the resident population for the kinds of biological markers that chronic low-level radiation exposure produces. None of this happened. No study was commissioned. No report was issued. No public health alert went out. Either the medical community of Springfield is so thoroughly incompetent that it missed something this significant for decades, which the radiation theory would say is itself a consequence of the contamination, or the medical community of Springfield knows things it has chosen not to report, which the denial and corruption theory would say is a consequence of operating in a company town where the company owns everything and everyone. Sideshow Bob deserves attention too, though his is a different kind of mystery. Robert Underdunk Terwilliger. Sideshow Bob is the most formally intelligent character in Springfield outside of Burns himself. He is cultured, educated, articulate in multiple languages, possessed of both a high-level intellectual framework and a genuine capacity for long-term strategic planning that most Springfield residents demonstrably lack. He has repeatedly engineered complex escape plans, elaborate revenge schemes, and sophisticated deceptions that required sustained planning across extended time periods. He is everything that Springfield's environment, under the radiation theory, should prevent a person from becoming. And yet he is also completely, comprehensively unable to accomplish any of his goals. His plans fail, his schemes collapse, his revenge never lands. He has tried to kill Bart Simpson on multiple occasions across multiple seasons, and he has never succeeded, despite being significantly more intelligent than any obstacle between him and his goal. The comedy of Sideshow Bob is the comedy of a brilliant mind in a system that will not allow brilliance to achieve anything. He can see clearly, he can plan carefully, he can execute with sophistication, and the universe of Springfield will not permit the outcome that his capabilities should guarantee. Under the radiation theory, this reads as the inverse of Maggie's situation. Maggie is extraordinarily capable and uses her capabilities covertly, below the radar, in ways that succeed precisely because nobody is watching. Bob uses his capabilities overtly, loudly, in ways that demand to be seen, and the system that can't accommodate his outcomes because he is operating visibly against its structure defeats him every time. Intelligence deployed in secret, as Maggie deploys it, can work within Springfield. Intelligence deployed openly, in direct challenge to the system's structure, cannot. The system is not designed to be improved or corrected. It is designed to be maintained. And Bob keeps trying to correct it, in his specific and violent way, and the correction never takes. Apu Nahasapi Mapatilon, the proprietor of the Quick E-Mart, the convenience store that is in many ways more central to the daily life of Springfield's residents than any other commercial establishment in the town, is a character the show has complicated and compromised in ways that extend well beyond the controversies his depiction generated later in the show's run. Within the show's own universe, Apu is a character of considerable hidden depth, a man with a PhD in computer science working as a convenience store clerk in a small American city because the job was there and it provides stability, who has chosen to remain in Springfield and build his life there despite having credentials and capabilities that would be highly portable to virtually any environment. Why Springfield? Why stay? Under the radiation theory, it's possible that a man who has lived in Springfield long enough has experienced the same compromised cognition as its other residents, the same subtle erosion of the risk assessment and creative problem-solving that would otherwise prompt someone in his position to look more broadly at his options. Under the coma theory, Apu's presence in the dream is the presence of a community member whose specific qualities Homer's unconscious mind reached for when constructing the texture of the neighborhood, the accent, the facility, the specific warmth and resilience that Apu's character is given. Under the denial theory, Apu's presence in Springfield is the presence of someone who has made peace with his environment and chosen not to examine certain aspects of it too closely, which is the choice Springfield seems to encourage in everyone. The pattern across all of these secondary characters is consistent. Springfield contains people who are capable of seeing clearly, capable of acting differently, capable of departing from the arrangement that keeps everything in place. And the arrangement defeats them. Not through direct suppression, though the principle and the pauper shows that direct suppression is available when needed, but through the subtler and more comprehensive mechanism of an environment that is simply hostile to clarity. The contamination clouds the thinking. The denial turns off the lights. The loop absorbs the efforts at change and resets to the default. And everyone who tries, or who could try, ends up in more or less the same position as everyone else. In Springfield, doing what Springfield people do, sustaining a system they didn't design and cannot quite see and don't know how to escape. Every Halloween since 1990, The Simpsons has produced at least one Treehouse of Horror episode, an anthology of short horror comedy segments that operate outside the show's normal continuity, in a space where characters can die, where the rules of the universe can be explicitly broken, where the show can reach directly into the genre traditions of horror and science fiction and fairy tale, and do things that the regular episodes cannot. The Treehouse of Horror episodes are explicitly non-canonical. The show brackets them as separate from the main continuity in multiple ways. The wraparound sequences, the tone, the deaths of major characters that don't carry over. They are the show's pressure valve, the space where things that can't be shown in the main universe are shown, consequences free, in a different register. But here's what's interesting about the Treehouse of Horror in the context of everything we've discussed tonight. A significant number of the scenarios these specials depict scenarios that are explicitly labeled as non-canonical horror fantasies are less strange, less extreme, and less dark than the theories we've been exploring about what is actually happening in the regular continuity. A Treehouse of Horror episode shows Homer being turned into a jack-in-the-box by a witch's curse. A theory about the regular continuity shows Homer being maintained in a state of permanent cognitive limitation by a combination of childhood brain damage, decades of radioactive contamination, and the institutional interest of his employer in keeping him exactly as limited as he is. The Treehouse version is a horror fantasy. The theory version is a description of the actual show. Which one is actually scarier? A Treehouse of Horror segment shows Springfield being taken over by aliens. A theory about the regular continuity shows Springfield being run by a man who is over a century old, maintained by weekly radiation treatments, sustained by a system of institutional corruption so comprehensive that no regulatory body has ever successfully held him accountable, and who has shaped the town's economic, social, and cognitive reality in his own image across more than a generation. The Treehouse aliens are explicitly fantastic. Burns is explicitly canonical. A Treehouse of Horror segment shows the characters trapped in a television show, unable to escape the fiction they're embedded in. A theory about the regular continuity, the coma theory, shows one character trapped inside a dream, unable to wake up, running a simulation of his life that gets stranger as his brain deteriorates, with no apparent mechanism for escape available to him. The Treehouse version is played for comedy. The coma theory is the most emotionally devastating reading of the show available. The relationship between the Treehouse episodes and the regular continuity is usually understood as the show letting off steam, taking its characters somewhere the regular show can't go, exploring darker or more extreme territory in a contained, consequence-free space. But what the accumulated evidence of all the theories we've explored tonight suggests is that the containment is somewhat illusory. The darkest things in the Treehouse episodes are not actually darker than what the regular continuity, read carefully, is already depicting. The show uses the Treehouse of Horror as a release valve for horror content, but the regular episodes, examined through the theories, contain horror that is in many ways more complete and more disturbing than anything the specials produce, precisely because the regular episodes insist on depicting it straight, without the Halloween framing, without the explicit label that says this is a fantasy, just as the show, running normally, doing what it does. That is the final thing the Treehouse of Horror reveals about Springfield. The horror doesn't need a special episode. It's already in the regular programming. You just have to be willing to look at it without the framing device. Springfield has its own media ecosystem, and that ecosystem is worth spending time on because it is one of the show's most carefully constructed pieces of self-reference. A mirror within the mirror that reflects something specific about the relationship between entertainment and the people it serves. Krusty the Clown is the central figure of Springfield's children's entertainment landscape. He hosts a television program that has been running, apparently, for as long as the show itself has been running. He is beloved by Springfield's children, particularly Bart, with an intensity that the show depicts as something approaching religious devotion. Bart's relationship with Krusty is the most uncritically adoring relationship in the show. The one relationship where Bart's characteristic skepticism and resistance seem to completely disappear in the face of a performer, who is, by any objective assessment, a deeply compromised figure. Krusty is a gambling addict. He has significant debt at various points in the show's run. He has been convicted of armed robbery, which turned out to be a misunderstanding, and the resolution of that particular plot is one of the show's most carefully constructed explorations of media and image, and the way public perception can be shaped by whoever controls the narrative. He has repeatedly exploited the affection of his audience children who trust him, who have organized their emotional relationship with television around his program for commercial gain. He licenses his image to products he has not tested and sometimes has not seen. He endorses foods that have been depicted as harmful. He treats his audience, at the level of production and commerce, as a resource to be extracted rather than a constituency to be served. And Bart loves him. Unconditionally, consistently, across every episode where Krusty does something that should erode that love. The show is depicting something real about the relationship between children and entertainment figures, about the way parasocial attachment to a performer can persist even when everything that performance represents is, on examination, not worthy of the attachment it generates. Bart's love for Krusty is not really about Krusty the person. It's about what Krusty represents, a presence in Bart's life that is consistent, that is entertaining, that provides a specific kind of comfort and excitement and engagement that the actual texture of Bart's daily life doesn't always offer. The performance is the relationship. The person behind the performance is almost beside the point. Itchy and Scratchy is the show within Krusty's show, the cartoon that Springfield's children watch, which depicts a mouse and a cat engaged in an ongoing cycle of grotesque violence that the children find hilarious. Itchy always wins, Scratchy always suffers. The violence is spectacular, detailed, and played entirely for comedy. And the show uses Itchy and Scratchy in various episodes as a direct comment on its own situation, on the relationship between the violence and chaos it depicts and the comedy it generates, on the way audiences process extreme content when it's filtered through animation and humor, on what it means to find something funny that, in a different context, would be horrifying. The episode where Marge campaigns to have Itchy and Scratchy's content made less violent is one of the show's most precisely structured self-critiques. Marge succeeds. The show is changed. The violence is removed, replaced by gentle, wholesome content. And the children of Springfield stop watching. They go outside. They play. They engage with the world directly in a way they don't when the show is providing the violent spectacle they came for. The show is making an argument, with uncomfortable directness, about the relationship between the extreme content it provides and the attention it receives. Take away the darkness, and the audience disappears. The darkness is part of the deal. The Simpsons has always understood this about itself. The darkness, the contamination, the conspiracy, the broken family, the impossible town is not incidental to the comedy. It is what makes the comedy matter. A family that has it together doesn't need the comedy the same way. A town that is functioning normally doesn't produce the kind of material that has sustained this show for 36 seasons. The darkness is the raw material. The comedy is what the show makes from the darkness, turning it into something that can be watched, something that can be laughed at, something that feels survivable because the family is still on the couch and the theme music is still playing. Krusty sells it. He has always sold it. He sells it badly, corruptly, with a hand in the till and one eye on the stock ticker, and very little genuine care for what his audience is getting in return for their attention. But he sells it consistently, and the children keep watching, and the relationship between the performer and the audience sustains itself across decades on the basis of something that has very little to do with the quality of what's being provided and everything to do with the habit of showing up. That is the relationship The Simpsons has with its own audience too. In the end, the habit of showing up, the comfort of the familiar, the knowledge that on Sunday night at 8 o'clock, something will be there that has always been there, that was there when you were a child and will be there for your children and will be there for their children, unchanged in its fundamental structure, running the loop, holding the pause. Krusty will be on television, Itchy will hit Scratchy, Homer will go to work and come home and sit on the couch, the theme music will play, the family will converge, and Springfield will carry on, as it always has, in the only way it knows how. By not changing, by not looking too closely, by choosing every week to be exactly what it has always been. That choice is the most human thing about it, and the most terrifying. One of the most consistently under-examined aspects of the Springfield mystery is the economic one, because Springfield's economy, when you look at it carefully, makes no sense. Not in the way that fictional town economies sometimes fail to account for logistics that the story doesn't need to address. In the way that suggests something specific is happening with how wealth flows in this community that the surface narrative is not acknowledging. Start with the most basic economic fact about Springfield. The nuclear power plant is its primary industry. The plant employs a significant portion of the working population. It is the largest single economic entity in a town that also has a moderately sized downtown, a harbor, what appears to be a functioning industrial district, and various service businesses that sustain the ordinary commercial life of the community. The plant is the anchor. Without the plant, the economic foundation of Springfield collapses. This means that every resident of Springfield who works at the plant, or whose employment depends on the plant's operation, or whose business serves the people employed at the plant, has a direct financial stake in the plant continuing to operate. And the plant is operated by Burns, which means everyone in Springfield who benefits economically from the plant's operation has a direct financial stake in Burns's continued control of it. Springfield's economic structure has been engineered to make challenging Burns equivalent to challenging your own financial survival. You cannot fight the man who signs your paycheck. You cannot fight the man whose paycheck, even at several removes of commercial relationship, is what makes your own paycheck possible. This is not accidental. This is a feature of the arrangement, not a flaw in it. Burns is not merely wealthy in the abstract sense of having accumulated capital that he can deploy. Burns is wealthy in the specific, structural sense of owning the thing that everyone else depends on. That kind of wealth is qualitatively different from wealth that can be moved or diversified or replaced. It is positional wealth, control of infrastructure wealth, the kind of wealth that is less like having a lot of money and more like being the person who controls whether there is electricity. You cannot live without electricity. You cannot run a town without electricity. And the person who controls the electricity controls, in a very practical and non-metaphorical sense, the people who need it. Homer's paycheck is small. His job is the lowest status position at the plant. He is one of many workers occupying a role that the plant requires to fill, but does not particularly respect. And yet Homer's paycheck is what Marge uses to manage the household, what pays the mortgage on the house on Evergreen Terrace, what makes the ordinary consumption of the Simpson family possible. Homer's economic relationship with Burns is not just a professional relationship. It is the material foundation of the family's existence. The deal that Grandpa struck with Burns adds another layer to this. The deal guaranteed Homer's employment regardless of performance. This is usually read as a benefit to Homer job security, protection from the consequences of his incompetence. But it can also be read differently. The deal keeps Homer exactly where Burns needs him. Homer cannot be fired, which means Homer has no incentive to look for other employment, which means Homer stays at the plant indefinitely. The protection is also a tether. The security is also a constraint. Homer is safe at the plant in a way that prevents him from being anywhere else. And Burns pays Homer enough to make leaving impractical, but not enough to make independence possible. This is the specific calibration of wages in a company town enough that people can sustain their lives in the existing structure, not enough that they accumulate the resources to build a different structure. The Simpsons family is perpetually one catastrophe away from financial crisis. This is depicted as comedy Homer's impulsive spending, Marge's resourceful household management, the gap between the life they aspire to and the life they can afford. But it is also, under the economic theory, a deliberate feature of how Burns has structured compensation at the plant, enough to sustain, not enough to escape. The Springfield economy also features Mr. Burns in a relationship with the local government that is essentially indistinguishable from corruption, except that calling it corruption implies a baseline of non-corrupt function from which it represents a departure. In Springfield, the arrangement between the town's major economic entity and its governmental structures appears to be the default rather than an exception. Mayor Quimby, the town's perpetually re-elected politician, is depicted as corrupt in such a comprehensive and enthusiastic way that the show treats it as a character trait rather than a scandal. He takes bribes. He uses municipal funds for personal purposes. He manages his political relationships through deal-making that has very little to do with the public interest he nominally serves. Mayor Quimby and Mr. Burns are not depicted as having a specific, documented corrupt relationship in the same way that the Grandpa deal is specific and documented. But they occupy the same community, and their interests are aligned in ways that produce outcomes that consistently favor Burns. The regulatory environment in Springfield, the local enforcement of safety standards, the oversight of industrial operations, the municipal response to environmental complaints is so consistently inadequate that it effectively functions as a subsidy for Burns's operations. The city is not charging Burns the regulatory cost of running a plant with 342 violations. The city is absorbing that cost, distributing it across the tax base, allowing Burns to externalize the expense of his facility's non-compliance onto the population that is harmed by it. This is a form of wealth transfer from the population to Burns, accomplished through the mechanism of governmental non-enforcement. And nobody in the Quimby administration appears interested in changing this arrangement, not because they have been specifically bought in any documented transaction, but because the economic structure of Springfield makes challenging Burns politically suicidal. The plant employs too many people. Its taxes contribute too significantly to the municipal budget. The economic disruption of a genuine regulatory confrontation with Burns would be sufficiently severe that any politician who initiated it would lose their position at the next election to someone who promised to stop the disruption. The economic power Burns holds is translated, through this mechanism, into political power. Without a single campaign contribution, without a single explicit bribe, Burns controls the political environment of Springfield, because challenging him is economically irrational for anyone in the political class. This is how institutional power works in the real world, and it is how it works in Springfield, and the show has been depicting it clearly and consistently for 36 seasons without ever stating it in those terms, because stating it in those terms would require the show to be something other than a comedy. The comedy absorbs the critique. The joke is the container that holds the observation safe enough to broadcast. The economic theory of Springfield is, ultimately, the economic theory of a company town. Springfield is a company town in which the company has been in operation for over a century and has had sufficient time to thoroughly embed its interests in the social, political, and biological infrastructure of the community it sustains. The residents are not just employed by Burns. They are, in a comprehensive and multi-generational sense, owned by the arrangement Burns has built. Their economic survival depends on it. Their physical health has been shaped by it. Their cognitive capacity to evaluate it has been compromised by it. And their political options for challenging it have been narrowed to the point of impracticality by the economic stakes of doing so. That is the economy of Springfield. And it is running exactly as designed. God exists in Springfield. This is not a matter of faith within the show's universe. It is a matter of documented canonical fact. God has appeared as a visible, speaking, interacting character in multiple episodes of The Simpsons. God has face-to-face conversations with Homer. God intervenes in Springfield's affairs. God exists in this universe in a way that is not ambiguous or metaphorical. He is there, he is real, he has opinions, and he shares them. This raises a question that the show has never adequately addressed, and that becomes considerably more interesting when examined through the frameworks we've been discussing all night. What does God's presence in Springfield actually mean for the people living there? The most striking thing about God's presence in Springfield is the selectivity of it. God speaks to Homer. God appeared to Homer in a dream. God told Homer, in that dream, that his time was coming, a statement that, under the coma theory, reads as a prophecy of the coma. God later appeared to Homer again in different episodes, engaging with his specific questions and providing specific responses. Homer, in the cosmology of the Simpsons universe, has a genuine and apparently direct line of communication with the divine. He is, in some unearned and inexplicable way, someone God talks to. And God does not talk to Ned. This is not a matter of Ned's faith being insufficient or incorrect. Ned's faith is the most demonstrated, most consistently maintained, most sincerely expressed faith in the entire town of Springfield. He attends services without fail. He reads scripture. He prays with genuine commitment. He has organized his entire moral framework around a relationship with God that he maintains regardless of whether it produces any tangible return. Ned's devotion is real in every way the show depicts it. And God ignores him. Homer, who sleeps in church, who rarely if ever engages in religious practice with any sincerity, who treats his relationship with the divine as occasional and transactional, receives divine attention. Ned, who has built his life around the practice of religious devotion, receives silence. The show is depicting, clearly and without softening it, a universe in which the distribution of divine attention has no correlation with the moral quality of the recipient. This is either a statement about the nature of grace, that it is freely given without regard to merit, which is a traditional theological position that would actually be consistent with mainstream Christian doctrine, or it is a statement about the nature of the specific universe of Springfield, which operates by its own rules. And in that universe, the rules of divine attention happen to track very badly with the rules of moral behavior. Under the radiation theory, the God question becomes interesting in a different way. If the contamination from the plant has altered the biology and neurology of Springfield's residents, it may have altered their relationship with experiences that are mediated through neurology. Religious experience, including the experience of divine communication, has neurological components. The brain is the instrument through which religious experience is processed, interpreted, and remembered. A brain that has been altered by chronic radioactive exposure may process these experiences differently. Homer's damaged brain, in this reading, may be generating experiences of divine communication that a less damaged brain would not produce, or would produce in a different form, with different content. This reading has a certain grim consistency with the rest of the radiation theory. Homer sees God partly because the crayon and the contamination have left his brain in a state where certain normal filters on experience are absent. Ned, whose psychology was altered by behavioral conditioning rather than by contamination, processes his religious experience through the filters that the conditioning put in place, and those filters, designed to suppress strong emotional responses, may also be suppressing the kind of intensity of experience that produces the divine conversations, Homer reports. Under the coma theory, God's presence in Homer's dream is Homer's unconscious mind generating the thing he most needed to hear, in a specific moment, a permission, a warning, a sense that his life has meaning and direction in the form of a divine authority figure. Homer's brain, in the coma, does not know how to generate comfort for itself from within its own resources. It reaches outward, generates the frame of divine communication, and delivers the message Homer needs in that form. It is not God talking to Homer. It is Homer talking to himself, using God's voice, because Homer's voice alone doesn't carry the weight that the message needs. The God question also touches on the show's relationship with death and what comes after it. Characters die in The Simpsons, sometimes seriously, sometimes in ways the show depicts with real emotional weight. Maude Flanders, Mona Simpson, various minor characters across various seasons. And the show has, in specific episodes, depicted an afterlife, a heaven, sometimes a hell, sometimes something less specifically theological. What happens after death in Springfield's universe is not consistently depicted, but the existence of some kind of continuation is occasionally confirmed. Under the coma theory, death in the dream is particularly interesting. When a character dies in the dream, when Homer's unconscious mind allows a character to cease being present in the simulation, what does that mean? Is it the dreaming brain losing interest in maintaining that character? Is it a reflection of something that happened in the real-world news that Homer's family received and processed in his hospital room, filtered through the fog of unconsciousness and incorporated into the dream? When Maude Flanders died in the dream, did something happen to the real Maude Flanders? Did Homer's family mention it at his bedside, and his brain take the information and work it into the simulation? These are questions that the coma theory generates and cannot answer. They are part of the permanent ambiguity that makes the theory more interesting than a theory that can be fully resolved. The dream includes things Homer could not have known at the time the coma began. Either the dream is generating them from ambient information absorbed through unconsciousness, or the coma theory has limits that require additional explanation. The theories in the end are not systems of certain knowledge, they are frameworks for asking better questions. Let's slow down here, because the sheer duration of this show deserves its own consideration. 36 years, 36 seasons, close to 900 episodes. The Simpsons premiered in December of 1989. If you were 40 years old when it started, young enough to be a parent of the age, Homer and Marge were depicted as at the show's beginning. You are 76 years old now. If you were Bart's age 10 when the show premiered, you are 46. You have been watching the same 10-year-old for 36 years of your own aging life. Think about what has happened in the real world during the run of this show. The Berlin Wall fell 1 month before the premiere. The Soviet Union collapsed. The internet went from a government research project to the foundational infrastructure of daily life. Mobile phones went from brick-sized luxury items to the primary way that billions of people experience reality. September 11th happened. 2 Gulf Wars happened. A global financial crisis happened. A global pandemic happened. Decades of cultural and technological and political transformation happened, and The Simpsons has been running through all of it, updating its references and its technology and its cultural touchstones while keeping its characters exactly as they were in December of 1989. The show has been a constant through everything. That is the most remarkable fact about it, and it is a fact that most people who watch the show have stopped processing as remarkable because it has been true for too long. Constancy stops being noticeable after a while. It becomes the background condition, and you stop seeing it because it has always been there. But constancy across 36 years is not a small thing. It is an enormous thing. Institutions fail, cultural phenomena rise and fall, television shows that seemed permanent disappear. Friends ended. Seinfeld ended. Every show that was once the definitive American sitcom eventually ended. The Simpsons has not ended. It has not ended, and its characters have not changed. And the house on Evergreen Terrace looks exactly as it did in 1989. And Bart is still 10, and Lisa is still 8, and Homer still goes to the plant and comes home and sits on the couch. What has this consistency done to the show's audience? What does it mean to have a relationship with a fictional family that has lasted, for some viewers, literally longer than any actual relationship in their lives? The people who have been watching since the premiere, who were children or teenagers or young adults in December of 1989, have grown up, grown old, had children, had those children grow up. While The Simpsons have stayed exactly the same. They have watched this family age 0 years while aging 36 themselves. This creates a relationship between the audience and the show that is genuinely unusual in the history of popular culture. The Simpsons is not a show you watched. It is a show you have. It is a permanent resident of your cultural consciousness, present at the same time as your actual memories, part of the backdrop against which your actual life has been lived. People who grew up with the show can recall specific episodes in association with specific periods of their lives. This episode was on when I was going through that thing. This joke was a reference I made in that year. This scene appeared at a moment when my life looked a certain way, and I watched it, and it meant something that changed when my life stopped looking that way. The show has been the ambient medium of multiple generations of American life. It is embedded in the culture at a level below the level of active engagement present, not just when you're watching it, but woven into the language and the reference points of a culture that has been watching it for 36 years. And all of that time, the family hasn't changed. The house hasn't changed. The deal that Burns made with Grandpa is still in effect. The coma, if there is a coma, is still running. The contamination is still leaking into the same water. The fish in the river still have 3 eyes, and nobody is testing the water, and Homer is still eating donuts at the console, and Maggie is still watching, and Ned is still praying into silence, and Burns is still alive. What does it mean that we have kept them exactly as they are for 36 years? What does it mean that we have chosen, across 36 years of Sunday nights, to keep pressing the button? What are we getting from the unchanging family that the changing world is not providing? What does it meet in us? What specific need? What specific anxiety? What specific yearning that a fictional family frozen in time is the right answer to? The coma theory says Homer is dreaming because he needs his family to be preserved. He cannot let go of the version of Bart who is still 10, the version of Lisa who still plays saxophone, the version of Marge who is still there. The dream is the mechanism of that preservation. And the audience cannot let go of the version of Homer who still stumbles through the door at 5:30. The version of Marge who still has that impossible blue hair. The version of Bart who is still spray painting his name on things and getting away with it. The version of Lisa who still hasn't given up, who still believes that intelligence and commitment and genuine engagement with the world matters even in a world that keeps demonstrating otherwise. We cannot let go. We have been unable to let go for 36 years. And so the loop runs. And Springfield stays. And Bart is 10, and will be 10 next week, and the week after, and the week after that, and we will tune in each time. Because the alternative, the end of the loop, the end of the show, the moment when The Simpsons stops being something that is and becomes something that was, is a reckoning with time that we are apparently not ready to face. The show keeps running because we keep watching. And we keep watching because the show keeps running. And somewhere inside that loop, in a hospital bed in a town that doesn't appear on any map, a man who has been asleep since April of 1993 is still dreaming. We are all inside the dream. Every Sunday night at 8 o'clock, every time we pull up a streaming episode from 20 years ago, Every time we quote a line that we first heard when we were a different person in a different life, we choose to be inside the dream. We choose Springfield, and Springfield chooses us back, exactly as it always has, exactly as it always will. Evergreen Terrace, 7:30 in the evening. The door opening, Homer stumbling in, Marge in the kitchen, the kids doing whatever the kids are doing, the dog and the cat, the couch, the television, home. Tonight we have been in Springfield for a long time. We have followed the radiation from the cooling towers into the water, and from the water into the biology of every living thing in the contamination zone. We have sat with the coma theory, and let it do what it does to the show, not ruin it, but transform it. Make it something both sadder and more beautiful than it appears on the surface. We have reopened the Burns shooting case and left it open, because it was never fully closed, and the evidence has not improved since the verdict was delivered. We have traced the impossible lifespan of the richest man in Springfield and followed the machinery of wealth and medical intervention that keeps him running past the point where any natural process would have let him stop. We have watched Maggie watch us. We have thought about what is behind the pacifier, what is behind the enormous eyes and the deliberate silence. What the 36 years of watching and listening and processing and waiting have built inside a mind that nobody in Springfield is paying close enough attention to notice. We have examined the predictions and found both the mundane explanation and the unsettling one, and concluded that both are somewhat true and neither is fully sufficient. We have followed Mona Simpson's trail from a 1969 act of conscience through 27 years of exile and back to a Springfield cemetery and then away again, and then finally to the end that comes for everyone. We have looked at what her trail left behind across 3 generations and named the man at the origin point of it. We have watched the town vote to keep its lie, exile its truth, and criminalize its memory. We have watched the landscape refuse to be pinned to any state or any map. We have watched the timeline refuse to move. We have counted Hans Mollman's deaths and refused to accept that the count means nothing. We have stood in the gap between Ned Flanders and Homer Simpson and looked at the distance between them and understood that the distance is not ironic but structural. And now we are done. Or rather, the script is done. Springfield is not done. The loop is still running. The dream is still going. Burns is still alive. Maggie is still watching. And on Sunday night, the theme music will play and the family will arrive at the couch from different directions, and everything will be exactly as it was, and we will watch, and the watch will be the choice, and the choice will sustain the system, and the system will sustain the choice. That is The Simpsons. 36 years in. Still running. Still watching us back. Thank you for being here for all of it tonight. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, whatever brought you to 4 hours of Springfield mysteries, we hope it was worth the watch. The theories will be here when you come back to them. Springfield will be here when you come back to it. It always is. There are things we haven't touched tonight that deserve at least a brief account before we finally close the loop. Because any 4-hour exploration of Springfield mysteries is by definition incomplete, the show has simply been running for too long, across too many episodes, with too many writers each bringing their own specific obsessions and observations and theories about what the show is and what it should be doing. The accumulated mass of The Simpsons is simply too large to fully map in any single sitting. So let's take a few minutes for the things that exist at the edge of the territory we've been covering tonight. The threads that could be their own entire evenings. There is the question of the Simpson family's ancestry, which the show has touched on in a series of historically set episodes that span from colonial-era Springfield through the 20th century. The Simpson family has apparently been in Springfield for a very long time, long enough that Simpsons appear in the town's founding mythology, long enough that their presence in the community predates the current institutional arrangements by generations. This continuity of family presence in a specific location has implications under the radiation theory that are fairly alarming. If the contamination from the plant has been ongoing for decades, and if the Simpson family has been in Springfield for generations before the plant was built, then the question of whether the contamination's effects are cumulative across generations becomes relevant. Is what we see in Homer a single generation of exposure, or is it a 4th or 5th generation of exposure to whatever has always been wrong with Springfield's environment, predating the plant? The plant may be the most recent and most severe source of contamination, but the show's historical episodes sometimes suggest that Springfield has had a complicated relationship with its environment for a very long time. The question of Lisa's future is the most genuinely open thread in the entire series. The show has depicted multiple possible futures for Lisa, none of which it treats as canonical. In Lisa's wedding, she is a 23-year-old engaged to an Englishman, intelligent and principled, and slightly lonely in ways that feel absolutely continuous with the 8-year-old we know. In other speculative future episodes, she has been depicted as a senator, as a significant figure in various cultural or political contexts, as someone who has grown into the person that her intelligence and her values were always going to produce. The show believes in Lisa's future even though it cannot show it to us. It keeps generating these glimpses and then closing the window, but the glimpses are always consistent in a way that feels like the writers know exactly who Lisa becomes and have simply agreed not to say it out loud while the show is still running. What the radiation theory does with Lisa's future is dark. If the contamination has been shaping Lisa's biology and neurology the way it has shaped Homer's, and if the difference in outcome between Homer and Maggie is a function of how different people's biology responds to the same contamination, then Lisa's future under continued Springfield exposure is uncertain in ways that the show's optimistic glimpses don't acknowledge. Lisa is the smartest person in the family and one of the smartest people in Springfield, and she is spending her most cognitively formative years in an environment that the radiation theory identifies as fundamentally hostile to cognitive health. What happens to that intelligence over time, if the exposure continues? Does it sustain itself? Does it find the way to compensate and adapt the way Maggie has apparently compensated and adapted? Or does it eventually follow the trajectory of every other mind that has spent too many years in Springfield's contaminated air? The show does not want to answer this. It cannot answer this without committing to a vision of Lisa's future that would effectively determine her fate. So it shows the glimpses, closes the window, and lets Lisa go on being 8 years old and brilliant and refusing to give up. The relationship between Bart and Lisa is another thread that rewards examination. They are siblings who are, in most practical respects, opposites. He is impulsive and physical and resistant to authority and formal learning. She is methodical and intellectual and earnest in ways that the world consistently punishes. They should not get along, and they don't. Much of the time their relationship is defined by genuine sibling friction, by the specific irritations that come from living in close proximity with someone who is fundamentally different from you in temperament and approach. But the show has also depicted, consistently and with real care, the bedrock of genuine affection beneath the friction. There are moments when the comedy stops and the relationship is just visible, the specific love of two people who have grown up in the same impossible circumstances and who know each other with a completeness that no one outside the house can quite match. Bart protects Lisa sometimes. Lisa champions Bart sometimes. They are connected by the shared experience of being the Simpson children, which is a specific kind of experience that nobody outside the house fully understands. And that connection runs underneath all the friction and doesn't go away when the friction is at its most intense. Under the coma theory, the relationship between Dream Bart and Dream Lisa is Homer's unconscious mind generating a version of his children's relationship that is, at its core, loving. Homer cannot know, in the coma, whether Bart and Lisa are getting along. Whether the decade-long habit of sibling friction has calcified into something harder, whether the distance of adolescence and adulthood has made them strangers, whether the weight of what happened to their father has divided them or drawn them together. He cannot know any of that. So the dream generates the version Homer needs. Siblings who fight constantly but who would, when it actually mattered, choose each other without hesitation. The theory of Springfield as America's collective unconscious, an idea that runs through the prediction section and the floating timeline section, and really through the whole project, deserves one more pass here at the end. Because this show has been running long enough that its relationship with the culture it depicts has become genuinely bidirectional. The show began as a product of American culture, an observation of it, a satirical engagement with it from the outside. And after 36 years, it has become part of the infrastructure of American culture, not just observing but participating, not just reflecting but shaping, not just depicting American family life, but actively contributing to what American family life means and how Americans understand it. The Simpsons is not the only American family in the cultural imagination, but it is the one that has been there the longest without interruption in the most accessible and widely consumed form. And after 36 years of that kind of presence, it has stopped being simply a depiction and has become something closer to a definition. This is what a middle-class American family looks like. This is the kind of house they live in, the kind of car they drive, the kind of problems they have, the economics, the dynamics, the specific texture of the life. This definition has its own consequences. If The Simpsons defines what a normal American family looks like, and if The Simpsons depicts a family living in a contaminated company town under the shadow of institutional corruption, with cognitive impairments that prevent them from seeing their situation clearly, and without the resources to change it even if they could see it, then the cultural definition of the normal American family contains all of those elements. The definition normalizes them, makes them the background condition, makes them seem like the natural state of things rather than the product of specific, changeable choices. That is the deepest and most unsettling thing about the show's cultural influence. It has spent 36 years making Homer's situation feel like the baseline. The contamination, the corruption, the loop, the inability to escape these have been depicted so consistently and with such warmth and such comedy that they have been absorbed into the cultural definition of American normalcy. The fish with three eyes is just how things are around here. Homer at the plant is just what work looks like. Burns at the top is just what having a boss looks like. And the family, struggling through it all, loving each other imperfectly, surviving everything that is just what family looks like. Perhaps that is the most important thing the show has accomplished. Not the laughs, though there have been extraordinary laughs. Not the predictions, though some of them are genuinely unsettling. Not the character development, though the characters, examined carefully, are far more developed and far more complicated than their cartoon surfaces suggest. The most important thing the show has accomplished may be this. It has made 36 years of American economic anxiety and institutional dysfunction and environmental harm and family resilience feel like home. And we have lived there, in Springfield, every Sunday night for 36 years. We have watched the fish. We have seen the towers. We have heard God talking to Homer and silence answering Ned. We have counted Mulman's deaths and voted with the town to keep the lie. We have pressed the button and held the pause and let Bart stay 10 and Lisa stay 8 and Homer stay in the dream. We built this town, not Burns, us. With our attention, season after season, episode after episode. We are the ones who decided that Springfield should exist forever. We are the ones who decided the loop should keep running. We are the mystery in the end. And we will be back next week to watch it again. Before we go completely, a few final observations that did not fit neatly into any section but that are worth carrying with you. The color yellow is worth returning to one more time. We discussed it in the context of the radiation theory. Every Springfield resident is yellow, and outsiders are not, and this tracks with the contamination zone framework. But yellow has another quality in the context of the show's visual language. Yellow is the color of caution. Yellow is the color of warning signs on hazardous materials. Yellow is the color of crime scene tape, of construction barriers, of the indicators that say something dangerous is here and you should pay attention. The people of Springfield are the color of their own warning sign, and they have been living inside that warning sign for so long that they have completely stopped being able to read it. The town sundial, the one where Burns fell, the one whose letters pointed to W and S or M and S, depending on your perspective, is worth a final look too. A sundial is an instrument for measuring time using light. It requires the sun to function. Burns blocked the sun over Springfield as the culmination of his scheme in the Who Shot Mr. Burns storyline. And the instrument of time measurement, the device that tracks the light, is the same device whose letters were used to identify his shooter. In a town whose sun was being stolen by the man whose shooting the sundial supposedly identified, the sundial points you to the answer. The light that was taken is the light that reveals what happened in the dark. This is either a remarkable piece of thematic construction by the writers, or a coincidence of the kind that the prediction section taught us to be appropriately skeptical of. But it sits there, available to be noticed, patient as a sundial in shadow. The number 342. The count of safety violations at the plant. 342 is not a round number, not a number chosen for rhetorical convenience, not a number that signals anything by its form. It is a specific, oddly specific number, and the show never explains how it arrived at that particular count. It's possible the writers chose it arbitrarily, for the quality of sounding specific enough to be alarming without being so round that it sounds invented. But the specificity of it also creates the impression of a real document, a real inspection, a real count of real violations. 342 violations is not a cartoon number. It is the kind of number that belongs in a real regulatory report. The show put a real number in a cartoon and never explained how it got there, and the realness of the number is part of what makes the plant feel genuinely threatening rather than comically so. Maggie's pacifier. We have discussed Maggie at length, and we have discussed what the pacifier represents as part of her disguise, the piece of the infant performance that most completely signals helplessness and dependence, and that she maintains as the cornerstone of her cover. But the pacifier also functions in the show's visual language as a silence enforcer. The thing in the mouth that prevents speech. The show chose this specific prop for its most cognitively capable character, the character whose silence is her most powerful asset, and made the thing that keeps her silent, the thing most associated with her. The pacifier is Maggie's symbol, the way the donut is Homer's symbol. And where the donut represents Homer's appetite, and his impulsiveness, and his relationship with pleasure over responsibility, the pacifier represents Maggie's chosen stillness, her silence. The choice she has been making for 36 years, one day at a time, one scene at a time, to keep the performance running and the secret safe. One day, maybe, she'll take it out. And then we'll learn what 36 years of watching Springfield has taught the smartest person in it. That is a story the show has not told yet. It may never tell it. But the potential is there, charged and ready, every time the camera finds Maggie in the corner of a frame, watching everything, saying nothing, waiting. That potential is the last mystery of Springfield. The rest we have been through tonight examined, turned over, held to the light. But Maggie's moment has not arrived yet. When it does, Springfield will not be the same. Neither will we. Good night,